All right, good morning. Welcome to our third and final day of our Track 3.B.2 February workshops. My name is Jamie Gannon. I'm from Energy Division, working in the Resource Adequacy and Procurement Oversight section. And next slide, Lennon. So before we get started, I'm going to go through a few logistics. This WebEx is being recorded. And the recording will be posted on our website. You can see the website history page right there on the slide is where it can be found. I am being helped today by my colleague Lennon. And so if you have any technical questions that you need to ask, you can either send myself or Lennon an email or a chat regarding the issue. We ask that you note your surroundings and do an ergonomic check. Note the emergency exits around you. All right, so all attendees have been muted upon arriving in the WebEx, and we ask that if you are unmuted that you mute yourself back. Presenters for each topic will be identified as panelists only when their topic is being addressed. So today we have CAISO that's going to be presenting, and we'll be pulling CAISO staff in after lunch to be panelists. To ask a question during the WebEx, we ask that you use the Q&A function. Do not send messages through the chat to the panelist or the host privately. We prefer you use the Q&A, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. If you don't see it in your panel to the right, you can find it a little 3 dots at the bottom corner of the right of your screen, and you click that and open Q&A, and a little panel will pop up. Questions will be read aloud by staff, and then attendees may be unmuted to respond to the answer, and then we ask that you mute yourself back. Okay, just covering the ground rules again here. The workshop is structured to stimulate an honest dialogue and engage different perspectives from all parties. We want you to be mindful to keep your comments respectful and friendly. We also want you to use the Q&A feature only for questions or technical issues. So scratch what I said earlier about sending Lennon or I a chat, use the Q&A. And please don't respond to sidebar conversations in the chat. All right, so for today's agenda, we have not a full day today, but kind of a half day. So we'll be getting started shortly with Professor Wolak. He'll be giving a presentation on a document that was circulated yesterday afternoon with the slides for today, and it's a Q&A document that's meant to address some of the questions from the last Zoom call that he had, as well as the workshop that was hosted back in January, to address some of the questions and confusion around some of the aspects of the proposal. So we'll have that segment from 9:40 to 11:20, and then following that we'll have a stretch break. And then we'll come back to discuss Energy Division's bid cap proposal. This was a proposal that we put out in December. It was in addition to one of our paths, our first path regarding, structural changes, fixes to the RA program to address the structural changes, and it would be adding the bid cap to kind of the existing capacity construct. And then that'll be about half an hour. We'll break for lunch, and then we'll come back and we'll hand the mic over to CAISO, where they're going to be presenting on their UCAP proposal that they've been working to refine through their own stakeholder process, but they also brought it to the CPUC and have filed now 2 iterations of it in the Track 3B proceeding. All right, this slide's just recapping what the scoping memo, the revised scoping memo identified. I think the big takeaway here is that, we're aiming to in this proceeding look at larger structural changes to the RA program. And we specifically, or the commission specifically, wants to identify what direction it wants to go in with regards to these large structural changes for earliest implementation and compliance year 2023. So, larger down the road program changes, and that potential, and that would not be, I guess, next slide, Lennon. And a proposed decision on that direction would not be expected until May 2021. So we're right now in our track 3B2 workshops in February. Parties will have an opportunity to revise their proposals on February 26th and submit them into the proceeding. Comments will be due on the 12th of March on these revised proposals, and reply comments will be due on the 23rd. All right, so welcome, Professor Wolak. And I'm gonna now, I think, Lennon, do you want me to give Frank the presenter ball, or me as the host, do I have to do that?
I think you do. So that I can share my screen. Oops. Can you see my screen? Oh, here. Just
not yet.
All right. How about now?
Yep, we can see
okay.
now.
So thanks very much. So what the plan for today is to effectively just try to provide more context, details, logic underlying the mechanism so that folks can understand exactly how it would work. And just to start, I just wanted to reiterate the two big factors that I think are motivating this new approach, which is the fact that we have these very ambitious renewable energy goals, and the fact that California is very import dependent, and that what you need for imports is more energy produced outside the state than is consumed outside the state in order for them to flow into the state. And then the other thing that I think is important is just some data that I got from the is the fact that the volatility in annual peak loads, as you can see in the last column here where my mouse is certainly much higher than the volatility in annual energy demand. So the idea is we want to have a mechanism that's going to ensure that both these energy demand is met, but also that these peaks are met. And that's one of the big mechanisms behind the choice of this approach is this desire to meet these peaks, even though they are not known until they actually occur. So we want a mechanism that provides a strong incentive for those to be met, and obviously compensate for providing that those peaks will be met. The other thing that we have is this increased intermittency. And so what I've done here is just given you from the California ISO OASIS data, the hourly production of wind and solar and combined wind and solar. And the point that I just wanted to illustrate with the thing boxed in red is the second line here, which is the volatility of the standard deviation, the hourly standard deviation of wind and solar output just keeps going up. And moreover, the so-called coefficient of variation, which is taking that standard deviation and dividing it by the mean, which is, you could think of it as a standardized measure of volatility, standardizing it by the mean. That thing is also going up. So we've got increasing uncertainty in this intermittency and increasing uncertainty in this net, what we'll call net demand, which is the difference between system demand and renewables output. This just is giving you the hourly distribution, and the important thing to note is this blue bar here that's very high. That is not zero, that's just very low levels of output. In other words, this histogram excludes hours, the small number of hours in the year in 2019, where there was literally zero renewable output. But you can see that there is a very, very, in the language of statistics, large positive skew, meaning that you get many hours with very little production and some hours with a small number of hours with a lot of production.
Hey, Frank.
Sure.
I have a question coming in from Doug Carpel. I'm going to unmute his line. Is that okay if we take questions throughout? Okay.
Seem to be. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Frank. Yeah, I know this particular point hadn't been made before, and I think from a statistical standpoint, I don't really sit very well with this because we know that because solar has such a strong diurnal pattern, it inherently has a higher standard deviation than wind does, and so the standard deviation is always going to go up as the ratio of solar and wind in your renewable mix goes up, which is in fact what's happened over the last, over this period 2013 through 2019. So I think it's really important to be pretty clear that when we talk about volatility or uncertainty, what that really should refer to is the unexplained variance. And I think that if you include solar insolation as a covariate here in any sort of multivariate analysis, you're going to find pretty quickly that this increase in variance is not actually the result of any increase in uncertainty, as in we don't know what's going on in any particular hour. It's purely the result of the fact that one of the two components of the mix just has a larger diurnal pattern of variation, and that's what's driving all this. And I'm happy to walk you through all of that analysis later, but I do think that it's important that we understand that a lot of the that there's two categories of variance here. One is explained variance, which is driven by solar out or by insolation, so because of solar output, and then there is true volatility, which would be the unexplained component of the variance.
Yeah, I'm using the statistical measure of variance, so I think
but I think it's really important that you decompose it. I don't want to argue
about stuff. I'm just telling you what the
okay, well, this analysis is wrong.
No, this analysis is exactly correct. I am computing exactly the standard deviation of hourly output.
Sure, but the standard deviation doesn't tell you anything about volatility.
Output. What you make of it is the difference, but what I'm computing is exactly a proper statistical magnitude.
We can talk about that.
It is the standard deviation. Look it up in any stats book. It is the median.
I have a doctorate I have a doctorate in modeling, friend. So I'm telling you, this would not.
I'm glad, but this is what the median is. The median is the value that 50% of the hours of the year are above. The standard deviation is the sum of the differences between the hourly output and the annual mean squared divided by the number of observations. That is what I computed. Okay.
No, I know.
I just want to make sure that's what everyone understands.
No, certainly. And I think the context that I'm looking at is that there are always components of that standard deviation, some component of which is explained variance, and some component is unexplained variance. Like if you were to do a regression, if you look at the R squared, that is the ratio of explained to unexplained variance. And when we talk about uncertainty or volatility, what we really need to be
I'm gonna cut this conversation off, guys.
This is a side point. Yeah, sorry about that.
This is a very side point. This is what the data is, and you have to meet demand with this level of renewable output. The other thing that I think is important is what I will call the durations of intermittency. And what we've graphed, what we have here is essentially a threshold. So think of it as for each year in the sample, we're taking a threshold. Say, for example, in the box that I have, 8,000 megawatt hours. We're asking, once you cross below 8,000 megawatt hours, how many more consecutive hours are there before you get back above 8,000 megawatt hours of electricity being produced? And so what you can see is that what we're saying is the mean number of durations where you had periods below 8,000 megawatt hours produced. And then the mean, the standard deviation is the standard deviation of those durations. And then the interesting thing, I think, is the maximum, which says basically in 2018, the longest duration over which you had less than 8,000 megawatt hours being produced from wind and solar in that year was 527 hours, which is over 20 days, and actually over 3 weeks. Similarly for the case of 2019. So these are long durations of very low levels of output that essentially we would prefer to keep the lights on for. And again, this is just taken from the actual data. All I've done is just that. There's nothing else beyond just doing that to illustrate the essentially intermittency that exists. So as I said, these long durations are really the major risk that I think needs to be managed. As we said, the other thing about the large renewables is this need for investments in storage, investments in demand side participation and the like, all of which are essentially really going to be needed to support these business models to get those investments. And again, this mechanism, I think, provides those incentives for that to occur, because what we can allow is volatile wholesale prices that will finance these kinds of investments, because just like an energy trader, a storage facility earns money from essentially buying low and selling high, so storing when the price is low, and withdrawing from that storage when the price is high. So the final issue is this issue of electricity imports, of the fact that, as I like to call it, the harsh reality of electricity imports, which is in real time, imports go to the party willing to pay the highest price. And as I said, this mechanism can allow short-term prices to rise to the level necessary so that California will always be able to attract that import energy to California when it's needed. So what is the logic behind the mechanism, just to explain in more detail? So why are we shaping the energy deliveries to the actual pattern of system load? I think the entire discussion that we've just had is the reason for that, in the sense that these shortfalls are very unpredictable, and so what's necessary is to make sure that there is entities with the ability to meet those energy needs out there, and in particular the sellers of this energy, and the flexible demands. And the nice thing is that the mechanism also says that to the extent that you are failing to meet your obligation, or you are paying the actual cost to replace that energy from the short-term market. So the periods in when failing to sort of provide the energy equal to your obligation doesn't cost very much, the short-term energy price isn't very much. So you're, if you like, buying out of the short-term market it makes sense. In the case when that penalty is very high, buying out of that short-term market is very high, you will hopefully, as a supplier, be there and be willing to supply. So the other is that why do we define it as a fixed number of megawatts of energy during the delivery horizon? And that's simply because resource owners, and particularly intermittent ones, are better able to predict the quantity of energy that they're going to get during a given delivery horizon, rather than during any given hour within the delivery horizon. I think that same logic even applies to dispatchable resources. And so what we're doing is limiting the energy quantity risk that has to be borne by these sellers and essentially tailoring the product to the resource, what the resource is capable of providing, which is a certain amount of energy during a given delivery horizon. So that's the motivation for the fixed quantity of energy. And then the other is, why true-up auctions? Well, the reason I think for true-up auctions is we want to reward suppliers that are there when we want them. So in other words, we want to be able to say, okay, look, you were actually there when we needed additional energy. And so in the true-up auction, you'll be rewarded for the fact that you actually provided that energy. And similarly, you know, for the true-up auction in the negative direction, it's also going to be rewarding those entities that had sufficient energy, but it wasn't needed. In other words, provided that insurance, they will be compensated, if you like, for the extent of that insurance they provided against that demand uncertainty. And then finally, for the retail side, it is going to provide incentives for retailers and customers to essentially reduce their consumption, and particularly do so during stress system conditions, because essentially, as well as to invest in storage and other kinds of flexible demand, because of the fact that that can reduce their allocation of the amount of that they have to pay for this long-term resource adequacy product. All right, so how does frequency of compliance in true-up auction? So the way that this would work is that the compliance auctions would be for quarterly products run for 3 years in advance of delivery. So for example, just to give you numbers, in Q4 of 2021, you could run compliance auctions for deliveries beginning in Q1 through 4 of 2024, 2025, and 2026. So there are 12 quarterly products that would be auctioned at that time, and you would purchase 100% of that, the CEC forecast for Q1 to Q4, 95% for Q1 through Q4 for 2025, say 90% for 2026. Then as you move through the quarters, you get to say Q4, you do the same thing again. You could even have the auctions run each quarter, but just for simplicity, I'm just doing it, suppose you're running them each year, but you could run it and do the same stair-step process at each quarter. But the way it would work is in Q4 of 2022, you'd run the compliance auctions for delivery for Q1 to 4 of 2025, 26, 27. And you would just top up what you didn't buy in 2025, top up what you didn't buy in 2026, and so forth, up to, and then purchase the 90% in the first Q1 to Q4. And the reasons that I put the approximate on the 5% on the 10% is just simply because there would likely be updates of the CEC's forecast at that time. So you could be lower, you could be higher in terms of the true up that you have to buy. All right.
One clarifying question, who is buying unused energy in the true up auction? Could you clarify?
Well, if it's the centralized procurement, it is the centralized procurement process. But all this sort of thing could be done independently, where each market participant is participating in the true-up auction to essentially purchase additional compliance volume that it needs, or to sell compliance volume that it doesn't need. That's certainly possible if you want to run it decentralized. But for just simplicity today, I'm always talking about it as if this was a centralized procurement process.
So there's the centralized buyer, but who is participating, I guess, from the seller side? Are they the generators that are buying that?
Yeah,
it's energy. Okay.
Remember that the generators are the ones that get the ability to sell this energy through the certification process that determines what their annual firm energy is, which is the maximum amount that they can sell of this product for each type of unit that they have. and then once that energy has been sold, they then are the counterparty to sell additional amounts if needed, or to buy back the amounts if that amount that was sold in the initial compliance auction was not needed.
And maybe it would be helpful just to clarify, because I think I had trouble understanding this aspect as well, was, I mean, you're not buying back unused energy, right? You're buying back the hedge of the
Yes,
unused energy.
exactly.
So
It's always,
it's not like you're buying back unused energy.
no.
So
And the way, when we go through the examples of the settlement, it will become hopefully clear. But so essentially, in terms of this frequency of the compliance auctions and true-up auctions, this process of essentially buying in advance would continue until finally the first quarter of delivery occurs, which is in Q1 of 2024. And so in Q2 of 2024, we would have the first true-up auction for Q of 2024 based on the actual energy supplied during the compliance period. And then from that quarter forward, you'd always have a true-up auction for the previous quarter. And then you'd have potentially the 12 compliance auctions for the next 3 years in advance of delivery that would fill in. And then you could also run these compliance auctions independently, or by independently, I mean independent auctions, one for each quarter, or you could link them. In other words, what you can do is you can clear the market simultaneously for all the auctions. This will allow entities to sell products in all 12 quarters, and to ensure that they potentially get a revenue stream suitable, say, to finance new investment in generation capacity. The only challenge there will be it will require a bit more complex auction clearing mechanism, but that's not a big issue. You can essentially run multi-round auctions with where you're having a collection of products that are sold and clearing the market. This is under what's called, they go under the general name of what are called combinatoric auctions. There's a fairly straightforward process for how you would want to run such a thing. In terms of these design parameters that I've discussed with respect to the auctions, they can be changed. So for example, how far in advance you want to run the auction before delivery. The longer in advance you run the auction, the more technologies can participate. Given longer lags, you can get more technologies in, because they can actually be built in the time between the auction is run and you actually begin delivery. The number of quarters in the future that the auctions are run, that's going to basically determine how much revenue certainty you're going to give the seller of this energy. A longer number of quarters in the future gives them more years of revenue certainty, which then is likely, it has the advantage of revenue certainty on the supply side, has the disadvantage of revenue or cost certainty on the demand side. So that's a trade-off as well. And then finally, the advanced purchase fractions and demand forecast determines essentially, how confident might you be in terms of meeting the reliability goals. A higher advanced purchase fraction and a larger demand forecast is certainly going to give you, if you like, more insurance. All right, so thought it would be useful to go through a number of true-up auction examples. And we'll start with this base case that was in the previous document that was given. And what it has is 4 periods of demand, just to make it simple. So system demand is 100, 200, 400, 300 across the 4 periods for a total demand of 1,000. We have 3 firms that have sold this energy. Firm 1 sold 300 in the compliance auction. Firm 2 sold 200. Firm 3 sold 500. This then shows how those obligations are distributed across the periods of the compliance period. And it's just simply according to the weights. You get 1/10 in the first period, 2/10 in the second, 4/10 in the third, and 3/10 in the fourth. And you can see that's exactly how it works for all three firms. And then here we've got the retailers that are essentially have to buy the other side based on their total demand within the compliance period. So retailer one's total demand is 100, retailer two's total demand was 200, 300, 400, and so forth. And again, what this means is that since retailer 4 is only 10% of the total demand, its allocation of this energy is only 10% of the total, which is 100. And then again, the quantity weighted that we got from this picture right here of 1/10, 2/10, 4/10, 3/10 is how that is distributed for that retailer across the 4 periods of the day in terms of its counterparty to the contract. Okay, so that's the base case. Now let's suppose that, just like in the example in the paper, that demand is 10% higher in all periods, and for all retailers that is true. So what we've got is, this is system demand goes up by the amounts that you can see right there in darker red. And then you can see that the other assumption we're making is all firms in the true-up auction sell 10% more in every period, just to make life really simple to see how the mechanics works in the first place. And then you can see what happens to everyone's demand. Now, in terms of the mathematics of how you'd settle it out, let's just go through the example. So let's suppose that the initial compliance auction cleared at 60 megawatts for the original 1,000 for the 4 periods, but that, as we said, demand turns out to be 10% higher uniformly across all periods and retailers. And suppose that we said that each firm sold 10% more in the true-up auction at $70 a megawatt hour. And so it says, okay, given these assumptions, the load shape shares across the 4 periods are still, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. And then we're saying what was true is, in the short-term market, the quantity weighted average short-term price, or 10% times the price in period 1, 20% times the price in period 2, and so forth, gives you $55. And then the load shares for the 4 periods across the retailers, meaning the total amount that they consumed in each period, the total amount that each retailer consumed across the 4 periods was 10% for retailer 1, 20% for retailer 2, 30% for retailer 3, and 40% for retailer 4. And so this is giving, for firm 1, here are the resource adequacy payments that it receives. It gets essentially 60 minus 55, the essentially $60 contract price minus the $55 average short-term price, times the 300 that it sold. And then in the true-up auction, it sold 10% more at a price of 70, and that clears against the $55 price, so it gets those payments. And then in terms of the retailers, the way that these payments get then paid by the retailers is just simply according to the 2 things we talked about, which is their share of total system demand, which is they're 110 of 1,100, and they're 220 of 1,100 for firm retailer 2, and they then are just the other side of the compliance auction and the other side of the true-up auction. And so these are the 2 payment streams that then the firms would be liable for and the retailers would be liable for.
Okay, one question's coming in from Scott Olson. Did those suppliers in this example provide actual energy in real time? Is this what they are selling in the true-up, which is after when the actual energy is used? And how does this square with
This is just simply their net resource adequacy payments. I'm not, what they sold in the short-term market, they would be getting paid the short-term price times the quantity they sold. They would then be incurring the cost of actually supplying that energy. I'm not looking at that. I'm just simply giving you their numbers on the net payments they would get for resource adequacy, and then the net obligations, the retailers. In the case of the retailers, you could say the retailers' profits would be what is it selling the retail energy that it actually sells times the retail price minus the short-term price times that quantity of energy. That's their profits from essentially selling retail electricity, buying that power out of the short-term market. That would get added to their this obligation that they have in terms of these net resource adequacy. I'm just looking at the net resource adequacy payments, not the profits. But presumably, as we'll talk about, there would be a strong incentive for the sellers of this energy to ensure that they provided the amount of energy that they sold in this product, as we'll show. But for
Okay,
now, I'm just showing you how the thing settles out. So think of it as, for firm one, if you want to get the total profits it gets, you got to add in the amount that it produced times the short-term price for the amount it produced, minus its cost of producing that amount of energy, and then it's getting this payment in addition. And then for retailer two, you'd need to add in the amount that it's essentially selling at its retail price minus the short-term price times the amount that it sold it to its retail customers, and then subtract this from that, because this is also an additional cost that it has.
Okay, so just making sure we answer Scott's question. Scott, let us know if we didn't answer the question. I think in my mind, what Frank is trying to show here is this is the RA product and how it's settled, and it's settled against the real time, the short-term market energy price, but it's not the same settlement that's going on with energy. So it's the RA product and how it's settled.
Right, and so when later I will go through how the incentives that the mechanism creates, but for now I'm just talking about how the true-up auction works, how the RA settlement works. That's all.
And we do have one question. Do you want to take it now? Or,
Sure.
Okay, so Mary, I'm going to unmute your line.
Hi, Frank. If you're going to get to this later, and I think maybe this builds on Scott's question a little bit, but if you're going to address this scenario later, just tell me. But on that topic of the difference between what's going on in the auction and how these prices are clearing, in the auction and then in the true up, what you said last time is that the prices in those auctions aren't subject to any kind of caps, or it's just, a clearing price auction. And what I'm still haven't been able to figure out in my mind is if the energy that's actually being, dispatched is subject to a price cap. I'm trying to figure out what that means for, the profit that the generators make versus the payments that the LSEs make. It feels like there's a mismatch there, but I haven't really been able to wrap my head around that. Is that something you're going to talk about later on in the settlement slides, or can you talk about what it means if the prices in the energy space are, going to be lower because there are bid caps to what could have cleared in the RA auctions? It feels like something's wrong there, but I can't figure out what it is.
Well, no, I mean, the way to think about it is let's for the moment abstract away from the issue of essentially can we attract sufficient energy in real time at a low bid cap? Okay, let's abstract away from that, which is, I think, a concern. But to make life simple for ourselves, let's abstract away from that. But if you set the bid cap on the short-term market extremely low, what I would expect in this forward contract auction is that suppliers would go, well, wait a minute, I know that I'm never going to be able to earn a very high price in the short-term energy market because of the bid cap. Therefore, when I offer in energy into this standardized contract auction, I need to account for that fact in order to get and make sufficient money to keep my unit operating. So odds are I'm probably going to offer to sell that energy at a higher price to compensate me for the fact that I'm not going to get those periods with high short-term prices when I'm long relative to my forward contract position. That's what I would expect a rational participant in this auction to do. Right? I'm not going to sell my energy over in those quarters unless I get sufficient money from selling that energy to make me whole for the total cost that it's going to cost me. And if I don't think I'm going to get some recovery from, say, ancillary services revenues, short-term energy market revenues because of the offer cap, then I'm going to need a higher price to do that in this market.
Which is specifically what RA pricing has been set up to do, or has been expected to do all along.
Yeah, no, and I think that's
Okay.
it's exactly what I think should be the case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no one wants, at least I will put it this way, I certainly don't want the RA process to not compensate generators a sufficient amount to remain financially viable, to be able to keep the lights on into the distant future. The whole purpose of the RA process is to ensure that that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and do you have any examples further on that kind of include both of those pieces and overall settlements to show how the money flows in that scenario?
Well, we could, you know, a simple way to, an easy way to see it would be, to see it is just simply to say, okay, suppose $55 is the price with a, you know, a generously high offer cap. But as a result of this offer cap, the load weighted average short-term price is now $50. And you go, okay, and if firm one was just making and clearing all of the money needed to pay for its cost at the revenue stream that I just wrote in here, then what would have to be the case is that you would likely have to increase the price at which it's willing to sell in that initial compliance auction to compensate it for the fact that that quantity weighted average price is now lower. In other words, the difference between 60 and 55 needs to be bigger because of the fact, right, it needs to recover, you know, more money.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Frank, this is Michelle. If the whole purpose is to keep generators whole, doesn't this just seem like a really complicated way to get cost of service plus something? I mean, wouldn't cost of service just be a lot easier?
This is but the difference is that they are competing in a market to set the price 60. They are competing in a market to set the price 55. And if they're wrong, then, you know, they don't make as much money. If they're right, they make more money. I mean, that's what competition's all about.
Right, but if you just said they're going to price so that they're sure to cover their costs so that they can participate in the market, I'm just thinking, well, why wouldn't?
Well, no, they're going to. That's certainly what they want to do, but they are facing competition in the standardized fixed price energy contract market. The reason that I think that if you have an offer cap, this mechanism is going to work is because everyone knows that everyone's short-term price is now going to be on average lower because of the offer cap. So that's like a common cost shock that now, or if you like, revenue shock that everyone knows they're going to get. So then they don't need to coordinate to know that everyone needs to know that the price in the forward contract market needs to be a bit higher to compensate for that fact. And so, I mean, that's just how markets work.
But Frank, does this work if the market is short? This requires you to have excess capacity, right? So that there's competition.
Excess capacity competition does not require excess capacity if your procurement is done in advance and so that you allow new entrants to compete.
Okay, thanks.
That's
I
the
mean,
key.
okay, thanks.
There's a few more questions on this topic. I'm going to just read through them. I think some of them may have been answered. Eric asked, is the strike price used in these calculations unfirm across all settlement intervals in the spot market?
The 55? 55 is the load weighted average short-term price. So in other words, you take the load share in that period times the short-term price in that period, multiply those and sum them up. That's the price that the contract clears against.
All right, Eric, let us know if that question, if your question was answered or if you need further clarification. Okay, can I rephrase? I'm going to unmute your mic real fast. Okay, go.
Thank you, Jamie. Hi, Frank. I'm trying to understand something about the temporal dimensions of this during a day. So what you set up here seems like a basic swap, right? Where I have a quarterly amount of energy I'm going to get at the $60 price. And if I consume a lot at 4 p.m., I get that at $6. If I don't consume a lot at 8 a.m., I also get that at $60. And so from the point of view of the firms, they have an incentive to be able to supply me at the scarcity hours because they've agreed to give me as much energy as I want at $60. And that price could go really high. So they better be able to cover that obligation, right?
Right,
right. But it still seems strange to have the strike price be uniform across the day. Wouldn't it be better to target some kind of price shape at least?
It's I mean, I prefer it this way for the reason that I mean, I think that people can figure out how to price the average. And you'll see that it does is in the examples that I'll give. I mean, this makes settlement, as you can see, extremely simple. And moreover, it makes essentially selling the product. It's a single homogeneous product, which is energy. The firms can figure out how to sell that product.
Right. Okay. So the disciplining for the firm is that the real-time spot price can spike. And if they're not providing you with that energy, then they have to cover themselves in the real-time market.
Exactly.
From the point of view of a regulator, though, I could imagine a bunch of these firms kind of not doing a good job of thinking about their future risk like that and saying, well, we think we're on the hook for up to this many megawatt hours at a scarcity period, and not realizing that they could be on the hook for more, and then anticipating being able to buy from the real-time market. And then if they're all anticipating the same thing, the overall market coming short. So how does that help with that anxiety for the policymaker that the sum of all firm decisions or retail decisions will add up to something that makes the system balanced?
Well, that's where I think, as I said, that's where I think the annual firm energy designation comes in the sense that how much of this energy a given resource is able to sell is where you're going to essentially put if you like, the brakes on, at least in the initial stages of saying, okay, look, you are the sort of resource that I think can sell this much of this product, and you designate those amounts, and then given that those resources have sold those amounts, and there's no requirement that a resource sells up to its firm energy amount, so it is essentially on the hook for the commitment to meet that peak, and it bears the financial consequences of failing to do so. I think that it's a case of the upfront annual firm energy designation, the experience that you're seeing as the market begins to work, all of those things. I mean, at least I think what we're trying to do is make sure we keep as transparently as possible to keeping and satisfying the reliability requirements and ensuring everybody is there. So, I mean, I guess I'm a believer in if you have an incentive and a high-powered incentive at that to do something, you will very likely do it. And if you and so we should also verify to the extent possible that you are able to do it. But that is that is where the annual firm energy designation comes in.
Okay, just one more thing, Jamie. So, but as a retailer, wouldn't I have an incentive to reduce my consumption on low-cost hours so that I have more of those juicy prepaid hours supplied to me during high-price periods?
No, you always want to reduce your demand. Remember, the thing that's the line of retail one, that's what you owe. That's not what you're getting paid. That's what you owe. That's why it says long-term resource adequacy net payments for 4 retailers are. So you always have an incentive to reduce your demand, because by reducing your demand, you reduce your share of this obligation.
Well, I'll take that offline with you, Frank.
Yeah, no, we'll go through some of the examples will show that. Okay, so here's one such example. So essentially what we're doing here is we're kind of messing things up a bit more. We're saying, okay, suppose the 100 megawatt increase in demand only happens in periods 1 and 2. So now period 1's demand is now 150, whereas before it was 100. Period 2's demand is now 250, whereas it used to be 200. And now suppose that retailer 1 was the guy that consumed it all. The retailer 1 consumed the entire additional 100 megawatt, and so now its 4-period demand is 200. And as I said, suppose the entire 100 megawatts was purchased in the true-up auction, was sold by firm 1. So now we have to rejigger both the load shape shares across the periods, because total demand is 1100, but 150s in period 1, 250s in period 2, 300s in period 3, 400 period 4. You can see that those load shares change, which then means that the load weighted average short-term price is now going to change, because you're multiplying potentially different prices by different load shares. And so now I'm just saying, okay, suppose it's 50. Then the other is because retailer 1 essentially consumed much more. It now gets, as you can see, allocated 2/11 of the obligation, whereas you can see in the previous diagram, it got allocated only 10%. Okay, and but you can see it got allocated much more. Why? Because it consumed much more in the compliance period. And then you can see again the resource adequacy payments. Only firm 1 gets revenues from sales in the true-up auction. Firms 2 and 3, they didn't sell anything, so their payment stream is just what you can see there. And then in terms of the retailers, it's again the same thing, as you're allocated both the compliance and the true-up in terms of your actual share of load consumed during the compliance period. So you, as you can see, have a strong incentive to reduce that demand if you'd like to reduce your net payments for the resource adequacy obligation. Okay, so now we can talk about the case of 10% lower demand in all periods and all retailers, just to do the parallel to what we talked about before with 10% higher demand. All right, so
could we get one more question answered before we move forward?
Sure.
Okay, so Justin asks, how does a true-up provide price certainty to end customers or consumers of retailers whose fixed price contracts tracking market clearing prices, i.e. those customers are not on rate-based mechanisms?
I mean, the retailer is the one that needs to manage that risk. I mean, that's separate from their long-term resource adequacy obligation. I mean, how retailers manage essentially the residual short-term price risk, they can do however they would like. But these are their long-term resource adequacy net payment obligations. They can figure out how they might want to combine, hedge those, as well as hedge their short-term price risk. You know, they're completely free as to how they do that. This is just the net payment that they're obligated under this resource adequacy mechanism.
Right. Okay. And I think part of the confusion is, maybe I'm just reading through Scott's question, but is in the example, it says that energy is sold in the true-up auction, but it still remains unclear to me how energy is sold after the fact.
This is just the SFP energy.
Right. So this is the truing up of the financial product, the resource adequacy product.
Exactly.
It's not that energy is sold after the fact. It's that the product, the financial product, needs to be trued up. Yes.
It's always the product. I mean, think of it as just like today in the day ahead and real time market. We're truing up relative to what actually happened. That's all we're doing.
Okay. Hopefully that answered your question, Scott and Justin.
Okay. So and so now let's suppose everything's 10% lower, all periods, all retailers. So just the converse of what we talked about with 10% higher. So we say, okay, compliance auction still cleared at 60, but everybody was 10% lower, and we're going to assume that each firm purchased back 10% of the SFPFC energy they initially sold in the true-up auction. They did this for $40, and as you can see, that's less, obviously, than the $45 load weighted average short-term price, as to be expected. And the extent to competition in that auction is going to determine how much less that is. But then this gives us the net resource adequacy payments to suppliers. They're essentially the original that they bought in the compliance auction, and then the payment stream implied by them essentially selling, essentially buying this many contracts in the true-up auction, hence the negative minus sign in front of the second term. But because they're essentially buying it at $40 when the price it clears against is $45, they're making money on that. And then the net resource adequacy payments of the retailers are, once again, just what are your cumulative load shares for the entire compliance period times the various quantities and settlement amounts. And that's the obligations of the for retailers in this case. And then we can you know, make this sort of example a bit more complicated by saying, okay, now suppose that the demand decrease occurred only in period 3 and from retailer 3, and so now period 3 demand is 200 instead of 300, and retailer 3's total consumption is now only 200. It's not 300, which it formerly was assumed to be in the a compliance auction, and then suppose the entire 100 megawatts sold in this auction was essentially bought back by firm 1, and firm 1 paid a price of $35, and suppose that the load weighted average price was $40, and again note that 35 is less than 40. And that's, again, and how much competition depends on how much less it is. This gives you then the settlement for the resource adequacy payments for each of the firms under this configuration. And the thing you can see is that because of the changes in demand, you can see that the shares of the compliance obligation essentially, so think of it as in the case of retailer 3, formerly retailer 3 was getting 30% of that obligation, Now, because it reduced its demand, it is paying a only 2/9 of that total compliance obligation because it reduced its demand. And so again, the mechanism provides incentives for the retailers to reduce their demand in order to reduce that compliance obligation, as it should, given that what the long-term resource adequacy mechanism is doing is ensuring that system demand is met and allocating that obligation based on people's share of system demand that they actually consumed during that compliance period. Okay.
So Frank, we have one question from Nick, and I think that you just answered it, but I'll read it. Could you describe how this proposal supports increased demand side flexibility relative to current LSE incentives? Would this proposal modify rate design to expose customers to real-time rates?
It certainly could. I mean, no problem there. And it would for the one of the big things that it would certainly do is give incentives for, as I said, it would enable you to actually raise the offer price on the short-term market, which could potentially increase at least prices on days when that would be important to attract all the necessary power that California needs to California, as opposed to neighboring control areas, and provide strong incentives for demand to reduce on those periods if they are exposed at least partially to the real-time price for a portion of their consumption, as would make sense. And as again, it would give incentives for investments in storage technologies, because of the fact that the value of storage is the value of buying low, selling high, which certainly has greater value in a market where prices can fluctuate.
Okay, thanks for that. And then finally, are you truing up over the whole quarter or in each hour? I think that answer is.
Think of it as the analog here is what these 4 periods are in reality would be a full quarter. It's just that I can't do a whole quarter on one slide, but it would be literally, think of it as what the compliance period. I would recommend that the compliance period should be a month for allocating the, as I'll discuss, for allocating the obligation for the long-term resource adequacy product. But again, I think that's a design parameter. It could be a quarter, it could be a month, but basically, given that virtually all customers have interval meters, both are certainly possible.
Okay, I just want to make sure we're answering Nick's question. So he asked it differently. If policymakers have decided against exposing customers to real-time rates, I think they generally have, do we still get improved demand side response?
Yeah, because the wholesale price would still potentially be born, and therefore foster investments in storage and potentially, centrally controlled demand response, the sorts of demand response that I know is more politically correct, which is you essentially pay someone to be on an interruptible rate. All of those would become more lucrative for the customer to adopt, and therefore potentially get more adoption.
Okay, and would it make much of a difference whether load was exposed to day ahead prices versus real time or 15-minute prices?
Oh, I'm certainly a bigger fan of exposing load to as close to real-time conditions as possible. That's a whole separate discussion, but I think to the extent that you can do it to real time, I think that is certainly significantly more valuable to a market with a significant fraction of intermittent renewables that can disappear with very short notice. So, that certainly is, I think that's something in terms of the choice to make, but obviously, to the extent you can, you'd like it to be responsive to real-time system conditions.
Okay, and then last question, Mary asked, what happens if there is no true-up auction?
I mean, if there's no true up auction, then you're basically, you're not keeping your commitment that the total amount of essentially you're not keeping the commitment of the long-term resource adequacy mechanism, which is that total demand, total realized demand is always fully hedged in a fixed price forward contract. I mean, that's essentially the promise that the mechanism is making. It's saying we pre-commit to ensuring that all of this demand will be met either through initial compliance auction or through the true-up auction. I mean, one way that you could do it is you could just simply always buy a little bit more of this energy than you ultimately will use, and then don't have a true-up auction. That would just be saying you're buying, say, 105% of realized demand, 104%, 103%, and then you don't run a true-up auction. I view the true-up auction is another mechanism to address the concern that was raised in a number of questions, which is, how do we know that entities are going to show up in real time? Well, the true-up auction is, if you like, an additional source of benefits to the generators that show up and provide additional energy when you need it, both in terms of the insurance of you bought stuff you don't need and you get paid for the fact that that stuff was bought and what it was not needed, or the fact that you didn't buy enough and now you need to buy more. Again, generators are rewarded for both sides of that insurance, which you could say is an additional reason for them to want to be there in real time. Okay. So the next is, how do we incorporate renewable energy goals? Well, this is, again, rather straightforward, because particularly if you can buy RECs. If you buy RECs, then it's virtually trivial. A retailer with 100 megawatt demand simply purchases 40 RECs to meet the 40% RPS. If there are bundled RECs, life gets a bit more complicated, as I'll show in the next slide, but not significantly so. It just is, it becomes a bit more, it's just an additional revenue stream that you want to think about as a net revenue stream for the renewables mandate, a net revenue stream for the long-term RA, and then everything else is sort of is added to that revenue stream. So as I said, this logic, I think, really reinforces the need to be careful and thoughtful with how you assign this annual firm energy value to intermittent resources as well as to dispatchable resources to ensure that you're in good shape. Okay, so how might a bundled REC work within this mechanism? Is that, go back to our example of the first example that we started with, is suppose that retailer 3 purchases a bundled REC, and that bundled REC produces 90 megawatt hours across the 4 periods, the 4 compliance periods that we talked about. And the weighted average short-term price that it would be paid for that energy is $45. In other words, so think of it, if it's a solar resource and it only produces, say, in periods 3 and 4, then it would be the sum, the weighted sum of the price in period 3 times the quantity produced in period 3 times quantity produced in period 4, divided by the total production, which is 90. In other words, that's the quantity rated average price that it would have been paid had it sold this energy in the short-term market. And then if we say, let's just make it simple, let's assume that there's no true-up auction, meaning that realized demand was actually 1,000, so there's no need for this true-up auction. Then retailer 3's payment stream would be effectively its obligations for the fixed price forward contract obligations, and in its bundled direct obligations, which are basically just this $70 minus 45 times 90. that would be essentially, think of it as their renewable energy obligation. And the simple way to think about it is that what all you're doing with a bundled rec is you're effectively buying you're buying a fixed price forward contract at $70 that clears against the quantity weighted average price when that renewable resource that you have actually produces the energy. And so your net payment obligation is 70 minus 45 times the 90 that it produces. And so, it settles out very, very simply for the retailer. And then if the retailer purchased, say, 60 under unbundled recs at $20, its long-term and RA and renewable energy payment net stream would be what's written here. It's just buying the 60 recs at $20 per rec, and he gets from that a renewable energy share of 50% because his demand's 300. His total purchases of bundled recs and renewable and recs is 150. 50% RPS compliance is met. Okay.
Two hands raised. You want to take them now, or you want to get through this section?
Sure. No, that's fine.
Okay, I'm gonna take Eric and then Matt. Eric, I'm unmuting you.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. But since you've given me the mic for a second, I'm still confused. I'm buying megawatt hours for a whole quarter from a supplier, right? But then you seem to be doing this price analysis on a interval by interval basis. So is my obligation split up over the number of intervals during that quarter? So I'm buying the same amount of power for 4 a.m. as I am for 4 p.m. I'm not quite
let's
sure
go
how the temporal part.
Let's go back to the first example. How the contract clears, right here. This is the way the contract clears: is you bought 100, and it clears against the actual hourly load shape for the compliance period. So your obligation is 10. If you're retailer 1, it's 10 in period 1, 20 in period 2, 40 in period 3, 30 in period 3. Where do those weights come from? Those weights come from the realized pattern of demand throughout the compliance period. And then
I see. That's how you weight your quarterly obligation of energy into each interval bucket.
Exactly.
And it's
the same way for generators.
Is that a historical pattern or just
realized pattern?
Realized pattern. Right. So if in interval 2 I really drop my consumption, right, then I have more available from my contract in interval 3.
No, you remember the way that if you're a retailer is the compliant your allocation of the total energy is at, say, a month or a quarter. So you're going to get allocated that obligation to pay for the total amount of this product that's purchased based on your total consumption for the quarter.
I feel like we speak at cross purposes. Again, I should probably take that offline, but thank you for the clarification on how the obligation gets spread between the periods.
Yeah, so think of it as there's two ways that the obligation gets spread. One, it gets spread to retailers, that based upon their total consumption in the entire compliance period. The other way that it gets spread is once it gets spread to each individual retailer, it gets spread across the periods in the compliance period associated according to the realizations of load throughout that period. And the reason for that is that's how we get essentially each period total demand is covered with a fixed price forward contract.
Thank you.
Okay, Eric, would you mind lowering your hand? Thank you. Okay. All right, I'm gonna go to Matt. Matt, you're unmuted.
Oh, okay. Hey, Frank.
Hey, Matt.
How's it going? I had two questions, and this is still back on the previous section, and one is just really an observation, so related to the discussion that you had with Mary and Nick and Eric, I guess. But sort of the high-powered incentives of this approach, so you talked about how this approach could encourage storage or demand response or something like that, but if energy prices are still capped, at a relatively low spot, energy prices are still capped at a relatively low level, sort of as Mary posited, this doesn't work as well. Am I thinking about this the right way?
I would say it works, but it does not address, and I don't think any mechanism that has a finite offer cap on the short-term market addresses what I call the harsh reality of electricity imports.
Yeah.
And so if you are California and you're going to be reliant on electricity imports to be what supplies what you need, you've got to be willing to pay whatever the market bears to get that electricity, or no matter what you do in advance, it's going outside the state.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, that's what's going to happen. Or you're going to have to completely shut down your market and prohibit exports during certain periods, which I don't think is the way you really do want to run your market, since that's basically saying there isn't a market, and there isn't a market whenever the market really could work well. So, I guess what I would say is I don't think it works any worse, and may work a little better in that world, but I definitely fully agree that it's you want a higher offer cap if really you want to address this issue, what I call the harsh reality of imports.
Okay, and the same higher offer cap that might be required to attract imports might also encourage the demand side, or storage arbitrage and things like that.
Exactly. That's it.
Okay.
Frank,
That's it.
This is Michelle. I mean, if you have the harsh reality of imports, then why pay them a capacity price, right? You're saying don't.
Yeah, of course. That's my point. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just wanted to emphasize it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, that was my observation, but my question is, I'm still really confused about the true up auctions, and I was just wondering, whether you could explain the incentives of suppliers to participate in these true up auctions. So,
oh, sure. No, that's really good.
What's the cost for a supplier to provide more of this product? After
You're providing notice. Okay, so let's go to the 10% higher demand.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that the true up price is clearing at 70.
Yep.
You're getting paid 70 minus 55 for what you sold in the true up auction. You're getting paid 60 minus 55 for what you sold in the compliance auction. I think you'd prefer to get paid 70 minus 55. You participate in the true up auction, right?
Okay, but so the 55 is already known.
Exactly. So
okay,
you're clearly in the true up auction not going to bid below 55. I'm assuming that you would like to get paid money for selling additional energy in the true up auction. So I'm just saying, I want to give you a market determined, if you like, price premium for the fact that you were there and you were supplying power when we needed it.
Okay, but if there's no real physical obligation or exposure to spot like, why doesn't competition also just drive down the price to 55?
It might not. I mean, it all depends, because remember, to the extent that you're actually selling that 30, remember, it has implications for, are you short or are you long? So I would presume that the entities that are selling that additional energy in the true up auction are the entities that actually supplied the additional power throughout the compliance period, because they are the guys that are actually net long and could benefit from that. They won't be net short, and therefore being paying because of that.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with that piece, and also, when there's a buyback, like what cost the supplier is actually avoiding by
Here again, let's go to the buyback.
yeah.
So on the buyback, let's just to make it simple, let's go to this one. So it turns out firm one sold in the true up auction. And again, firm one knows that 40 was the quantity weighted average price. So competition essentially said he would only buy it back for less than 40 would be my guess, right? And if he buys it back at 35, he gets paid $5 times the 100 he sold. And so it's competition to essentially that is going to dictate how close that 35 is to that 40.
Okay. Yeah.
So he gets paid by doing that.
Okay. And does he get paid the 40 even though the
No, think of it as his payment stream. His payment stream is essentially the difference.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still missing something, but I don't need to take up more time with this. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, and I did get one more question from Chris. Chris makes a comment kind of question. It seems that suppliers will just increase the forward fixed contract prices to cover the market price risks, and then the end use customers will pay for those scarcity pricing impacts indirectly.
Only to the extent that like if put it this way, if you bought sufficient energy in advance, no one knows when the scarcity periods are going to come. You're basically buying at $60 energy over the entire period. So that is essentially you're getting essentially all your demand. If there is no true up auction, you're getting all your demand at $60. If your demand is 300, you're going to probably pay a little bit more if there's a true up auction, but as we said, most of the true up auctions will be very small for precisely the reasons that we sort of showed right here. There's not a lot of volatility in essentially load has got you can see very little changes across the year, and in particular if anything declining because of the distributed solar that's being put into the system. So it would be relative very, very small impacts on the price due to the realization of these scarcity periods. But if you allow the scarcity periods to occur and the high prices to occur, that will incent people that are willing to reduce their demand to do so, the people that can build storage to do so, and the generators to be online and supply, because to not be online and supply will incur a significant cost of buying out of the short-term market. Okay, so should I continue? Any more questions? Jane?
Yes, let's continue. Do we just time check? Do we have quite a bit of slides to get through before 11:20?
No, we're pretty good. We're pretty good, I hope. So in terms of California's integrated resource plan, if there is some resource that's desired by the plan, they could sell into this compliance auction, 3 years in advance, get the future revenue stream to finance the investment. What the nice thing is, the developer receives now a competitively procured energy revenue stream that allows all resources that are able to be built and bring online in 3 years to compete. If the project developer is unable to recover those costs from this revenue stream, then the future market in future expected in revenues, meaning revenues for future SFPFC auctions, not the 3-year auction, but in subsequent periods, it can then say, okay, look, CPUC, to meet your IRP, I can't make it, I need additional revenues. The CPUC can then say, okay, we think that we really want you to meet the IRP goal. We are willing to provide this additional top up, negotiated between the CPUC and that entity, say, but the seller of the project would still be subject to the construction milestones to provide the firm energy that was sold in the compliance auction, or buy back this energy in a future auction. And then you can even have a backstop process where essentially if the CPUC sees that a resource that it wants is not getting built, it can in fact make sure that resource is being constructed. It can take that cost and essentially and then essentially provide that annual firm energy into the auction, if you like, as a price taker, and recognize exactly the revenue stream from that, and then allocate that cost as well as any additional cost to retailers as part of their long-term RA obligation, similarly in the same sort of mechanism, so that to meet the IRP obligation, people are being assigned that above market cost of the IRP obligation according to the share of load that they actually serve within that compliance period. And the big thing I would just say there is you want to run this backstop, I think, sufficiently far in advance to be credible, meaning that that if you really don't think it's there in advance to actually construct the resource, you have to pull the trigger one way or the other, meaning you either have to say we're going to build it or we're not going to build it. Waiting to the last minute only encourages people to essentially not take you seriously. So I think such a mechanism, transparent backstop mechanism, would certainly create incentives for suppliers to do what was discussed in the previous slide of, trying to build these resources and that actually meet the IRP goals. Okay, so now.
So Frank, do we take a question? I've got one hand and I've got one question in the Q&A. So we're going to first unmute Nick, your mic, and you can ask your question.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Wolak. I want to ask a little bit about this resource development process. It's been something I've been thinking about from an earlier slide and some of the earlier materials that suggest that we don't currently have a capacity shortage. We just have a kind of intermittency problem. I'm thinking the current circumstances for CAISO and probably for the West is resource development and resource shortages is probably going to be the norm more than the exception. And I'm wondering if you see this process as being sufficient to get developers and financiers and suppliers, based on this sort of 3-year payment stream, to go out and finance really significant capital investments. We're talking about maybe 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts of firm capacity moving into Diablo. If that's sort of the norm, does this process sufficiently mobilize stakeholders to do the kind of investment we need?
I mean, that's something that I think is up for discussion. I mean, I would think that if that's, I think, something that the CPUC and would certainly need to decide. You could say, okay, is it 5 years where we're running these auctions for 5 years, 3 to start deliveries 3 years in the future? I don't see a fundamental problem with changing that. As I discussed earlier, it's just that is committing demand to a longer counterparty stream. But to the extent that the belief is that 3 years is not enough, that would be a logical consequence of how to get greater revenue certainty. But I guess my feeling is you certainly there's a cost to extending that length of time, but there's also you want to be sure to keep the lights on. That's where I'd say regulatory judgment comes in. But understanding the trade-offs, as I discussed in that slide, is part of it.
Thanks. Could I ask one other follow-up question on this? On the, I think it was the prior slide or maybe a couple of slides ago, there was a reference to like if the 3-year period is not long enough, the resource could apply to the commission for, you know, I'm guessing maybe a longer term funding stream. Could you talk a little bit about that? How you see that process working? Sort of who would this?
Well, I mean, to me, it's sort of if I would expect it to be the sort of situation where there's a resource that the state believes is necessary to meet its goals, that it does not believe that the market through its conventional revenue sources is providing sufficient revenue or will provide sufficient revenue to get that thing built, but it believes it is necessary and maybe believes that in the future that is coming, that revenue stream will materialize. Then, you know, that, to give a concrete example, suppose that the state believes, well, we really do need a pump storage unit because of the fact that we're going to be, you know, having so much intermittent renewables. Right now, we think that it's going to be tough for that pump storage unit to make it, but we think that when California gets to the levels of intermittency and intermittent renewables that are consistent with its long-term goals, it will be able to. So what we'll do is we will have that resource sell in the auction. We will then give it some sort of top up that we think is going to be sufficient to get it built, but maybe not as much as the resource owner might want, but basically maybe even saying that, look, we'll give you a insurance policy against the fact that future revenues don't materialize the way that we believe that they will, and maybe some sort of revenue sharing agreement with the plant owner, to make that happen. I mean, this is like regulation to meet a goal that is outside the market, which you could argue is what an integrated resource plan goal is.
Got it. Thank you for that, Dr. Wallach. I guess what I'll just flag is, you know, there's kind of a broader layer of retail choice on top of this, and there's a lot of discussions now about sort of centralization of significant, you know, long lead time procurement and large resource procurement. And I think from our members' perspective for Cal CCA, it would be concerning to sort of by default assume that all of this new resource development, if it needed some financial support, sort of becomes a centrally procured resource. So just to flag one kind of policy overlay with the other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
discussions here.
I guess my feeling is on that is that, you know, we all live in California. We all sort of you know, if it would seem somewhat, you know, I don't know. I mean, I would expect the entities that can't opt out would love to opt out. So, you know, you could argue that all resources, all entities will get the benefits of the integrated resource plan. Shouldn't they, in some sense, also help to pay for it? And what we need is I think, an equitable way to share those costs. And so that at least seems to at least one way of looking at it, the way that I prefer. I can see how others may prefer different ways. Okay. All right.
So there are a few questions. Do we want to, well, let's just take this one because this one's related to that previous conversation. So I guess the question is, how would this proposal ensure that the state is meeting its air quality and disadvantaged community requirements?
I think that that's going to be no different from any other mechanism, simply because in order to build a power plant, you need to go through CEQA, you need to go through all the sorts of mechanisms necessary to build a power plant. This is no different. If anything, I think this one has the potential to actually address those a little less expensively, because it is involving demand and involving flexible load and storage as much as possible in the process.
Okay.
So do you want me to continue?
Yes.
Okay. So this is just to show the sort of the hourly, if you like, incentives that a generator faces under this scheme. So think of it as the easiest way to think about it is the second line, which I'm running my mouse over right now, right here. That's saying that what I paid, I'm getting paid for in this auction for the quantity that I sold in this auction. That is a revenue stream I am guaranteed. This is the short-term market price that I can sell my power for from my own units. Q spot is what I sell from my units in the short-term market. And then C spot is just what is the cost of producing Q spot from the short-term market price. These are my hourly variable profits under the scheme. And what you can see is just that to the extent that I am producing, if you like, less than my obligation under the mechanism during that hour, I am very concerned about the level of the spot price, because this term right here is negative. This term, if it gets high, it essentially reduces my variable profit. So I want to, as much as possible, produce as much energy as I can up to Q contract, and to be in order to mitigate against that. It's only if the short-term price, only if Q spot is above Q contract do I care that the short-term price is high. But remember that the aggregate for the hour of Q contract across all suppliers is equal to Q spot. So, you know, there's not going to be any entity that is substantially in excess of that amount. So the idea is everyone has a very strong incentive to be into the short-term market for at least Q spot if, for at least Q contract if they think the spot price is going to be high. If they think the other, then clearly it's better to, as I said right here, it's better to, if the marginal cost of producing electricity from my unit is essentially above the market clearing price for the hour, then I would be better off buying the power out of the short-term market rather than running my unit. And how I make that happen is I bid into the short-term market for my energy up to the forward contract quantity obligation that I have, and you know that, and I would then get paid in those circumstances the contract price minus the spot price times Q contract. That would be my payment during that hour, even though I don't produce. Okay, so how about the mechanism and retail competition? The argument that I think is the fact that this obligation essentially creates a level playing field for retail competition. And why do I say that? It's because all retailers have the same obligation. It's based on their share of system load that they serve in the month. And the cost of that obligation moves with the amount of energy that they sell. As you saw in the examples that I went through, is that if the retailer reduced its load, its obligation to pay for that long-term RA obligation declines proportional to the amount that its load declines. And one of the issues that this eliminates is the fact that, you know, if the big retailers essentially buy an adequate amount of, say, capacity in a capacity-based mechanism and it bids into the market, those prices are going to be low prices in the short-term market, but that's because the large retailers were the ones that actually purchased the capacity. And so this enables the, say, smaller retailers to sell an indexed product that, if not for the actions of the large retailers, would be an extremely risky bet. This mechanism prevents that extremely risky bet from being taken, and instead, but does not prevent the retailers that are willing to expose their customers to hourly wholesale prices from doing so. In other words, this mechanism starts from a 100% contracting of system demand, meaning system demand is hedged at this fixed price, whereas the existing mechanism starts at 0 fixed price contracting of system demand. But the point is, you can start from 0, you can start from 100%. Where you end up depends upon what you do in terms of your own hedging of your exposure. And a retailer buy or sell bilateral deals between generators and other retailers, whatever it wants, to essentially expose its customers as much as it wants to the short-term price, but they bear the full cost and benefits of that. And so the mechanism is going to reward the retailers that find flexible demands and make the most lucrative use of those flexible demands. Those are the retailers that we would like to see come. From the perspective of market efficiency, is the ones that are able to find flexible demands and essentially realize all the benefits that they can provide. So,
so can we take a few questions here? I see one participant has their hand up,
okay.
And then we also have a few questions. But related to what you just went through, Peter asked, does this approach have implications for behind the meter resources counting for RA? So I guess, put differently, how would behind the meter resources count in this framework?
To the extent that they sell this product, they could count. But I mean, I would definitely have a extremely rigorous process of determining how much of this quarterly firm energy they can sell. I mean, I think it's, but to the extent that the CPUC and ISO determines, yes, we believe this resource can actually reliably sell this amount of energy to the wholesale market, that is something that they should be able to do and should be able to sell this obligation, because associated with this obligation is, as we saw, this payment stream.
Okay, great. I'm going to unmute Eric's mic so he can ask his question.
Good morning, Dr. Wallach, and thank you for all of this. I do definitely appreciate it. Can you go back just a couple of pages?
Which one?
One more. Yeah, so in this formula, and I think it comes down to something that was being mentioned earlier, I think this formula, in saying that the spot price, they have an incentive to make sure it's low, what it seems to ignore is the alternative spot markets in other neighboring balancing authorities, right? So this is basically dependent upon the idea that the spot price in California would be the same or very similar to a spot price in another market. Is that correct?
As I said earlier, the cruel reality of imports, you can't escape it. And so, yes, you have to be in California willing to pay the most in real time if you want to get the power to California under any long-term resource adequacy mechanism. Yes.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I see kind of two dependencies here that I want to make explicit. One, the dependency that the prices in the spot markets need to go sufficiently high, which we've discussed quite a bit.
Under any long-term resource adequacy mechanism, regardless of what it is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. I'm not sure I agree with that, but we can.
I certainly do.
Okay.
Because you can't stop people from selling in the most lucrative place. Unless, of course, you're willing to curtail exports in real time, which you could do under this scheme too.
Right. So the curtailment of exports, I think,
and personally, I don't think you want to curtail exports, because then people will stop wanting to import to your market. I think we want to keep the integrity of the market.
Yeah, and understand and appreciate that. So the second piece that I think this is highly dependent on is that you talked about these buyback mechanisms, and it seems to me the only way that those really efficiently work is in a centralized clearing market. If you're doing this bilaterally, the ability to do buybacks is going to be extraordinarily limited. Do you agree with that?
Oh, no, of course. I mean, people trade products all the time. I think the big thing is just to create a standardized product that people can buy and sell. And as long as it is a standardized product, I think that the market I would fully expect there to be brokers that could help you to buy and sell and trade these things. All you need is just a standardized product. And so, yes, if it's not a standardized product, then yes, it's a problem. But that's definitely not. That's why the first word in what is called standardized, because it is a standardized product.
Okay, I'm just wondering if the transactional costs of doing that outweigh benefits, but appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Yeah, I would expect that there's, I mean, many products trade homogeneous products. I mean, think of it as the global oil market trades oil all over the world, and there's no centralized market. But yeah, so I think that the transactions cost would be pretty small. But
okay,
there would be competition for the transactions cost too. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay, I think this is where we were. As we said, is physical feasibility. So one of the things that I think is useful in this mechanism is, suppose we go to this quarterly. We could define firm energy on a quarterly basis rather than, say, annually. And it could account for the seasonality in California's wind and solar production. In particular, we know that California gets a heck of a lot more wind and solar production in the summer months. And so we could adjust up the amount of firm energy that could be sold in a quarterly auction for the season in which that energy is sold. That would be certainly one thing that could be done. But I think that, going through and thinking about this issue, but the nice thing is that, the greater the level of reliability that you want, the more conservative you can be with this annual firm energy valuation process. But the idea, at least I think, is, by creating this homogeneous product energy, which is what consumers want, what you're doing is procuring that through an anonymous auction mechanism far enough in advance of delivery to allow new investment to compete, is the best way to get a competitive price for this product. And so homogeneity, advanced purchase are going to be two things that are working in favor of making this thing a very competitive market. Okay, and again, it's just to reemphasize that this is really a purely financial product, but it has these very favorable incentives that it provides for resources to offer into the ISO markets to supply energy during stressed system conditions and the like, as we've just discussed. All right. And then, the other is just the local issues. And here the idea is just fundamentally planning in advance, that the important component with dealing with local issues is making sure that you're looking at these things far enough in advance so that they can be managed in a competitive manner. Doing something the day before is likely to be not as competitive as doing something with sufficient advance notice. This gets back to the issue of the backstop procurement and doing that in advance. Okay, so I think in terms of just the last bit is just to talk about the transition, is that there obviously will need to be a significant transition. In particular, probably, if you're starting, as the example that I gave, if you're starting a new mechanism, it would not really be able to start until, say, if you ran the first auction in December of 2021, it would not be really in play until quarter one of effectively 2024. And you wanted enough advance notice, you can work out all of the kinks in terms of the local issues, the annual firm core quantity, quarterly firm energy magnitudes, all the things that you need to then slowly roll this thing in. And so just to finish up, this is just my favorite quote from Machiavelli talking about the impossibility of change in bureaucratic institutions. Just so I thought it was entertaining.
All right, so thank you, Frank. We do have a few questions, and I know that we're at time here in order for us to take our break. Do we want to go into the break and attempt to answer some of them while recording? And we have a few minutes before 11:30. We'll use it to take the break. Does that work?
It's fine with me.
Okay. So if others can't stay, we're going to be recording, so you can, look at the recording after to see the questions answered. So give me a minute here. Okay, so Brian asks, is the seller's obligation to provide energy in a given hour determined ex post based on actual realized load, or is it determined ex ante based on projections of load?
Ex post. It's determined ex post, but I have some examples to show how you can and this is not in the slides obviously, but how you can do preliminary settlement where you give the entity an idea of essentially what their obligation will be, and that's the good news associated with this product, is that it at least as a show, the extent of uncertainty that you as a resource owner would face over the quarter associated with settling based on actual load versus settling the preliminary settlement is in virtually all cases not significant. And it's only significant in the cases or probably noticeable in the cases that you'd want it to be noticeable, meaning that when there is a real stressed system condition and you want the generators to be there to make sure to keep the lights on. But if basically the quarter goes pretty much without any real reliability incidences, settling on the preliminary sort of settlement versus the final settlement will be very small differences. And that's basically the whole purpose of the design of the mechanism, is to say, look, we want you to be particularly focused on meeting system peaks or stressed system conditions. That's what we want you to be there and be really ready. To the extent that you may not meet it during times when the system's not stressed, the cost of not doing that is relatively minor.
Okay. So Scott asks, if a retailer's load only varies by 5% from the load shape that the central buyer purchases for them through the SFPFC, does this imply that roughly 95% of a retailer's costs will be covered by the standard fixed price contract? Wouldn't this be bad for competition?
Remember, this is just your obligation. How much you want to, I mean, you could literally, as a retailer, you could sell somebody a counter position that essentially unwinds the entire position for you. I would think that'd be an extremely imprudent thing for you to do as a retailer. But you, as I said right here, you can essentially expose your customer to as much real-time price risk as you'd like to expose them to. You can either start from 0, go up to your desired level, or start from 100 and go down to your desired level. Either works. It's just that everyone pays their load share of the resource adequacy obligation. No escaping that. That's the way the mechanism works.
All right. So essentially, you're saying that the retailer can make hedges outside of this product if it wants to manage,
or if it wants to expose itself more to short-term price volatility, it could do that. Now, one might argue that could be imprudent for it to do, but you know, that it as I said, it has that option.
Okay, great. All right, Doug has a question related to, I guess, the interaction between RPS and IRP. So could you walk me through how our existing long-term contracts with generators for RA energy and renewable energy attributes would be treated under this mechanism? If we already have long-term PPAs that would they simply be netted against our SFPFC obligation?
No, it's right here. You basically, the second term right there is you as a retailer. So think of it as, just to make life really simple, that think of this as the retailer's got that 60 minus 55 times 300. That's its long-term RA payment. And then the 70 minus 45, that's basically what it's paying for the renewable attribute of the bundled rec that it bought. Done. And then the rest of its profits then are these costs, and then plus the net profits from selling what it actually sells to final consumers at the retail price, minus the cost of buying that energy at the short-term price. That is its revenue stream, its profit stream right there. That magnitude minus this.
All right, hopefully that answered your question. But if you do have other questions on this topic, feel free to reach out and we can discuss. There is another question coming in from Ian White. How is any planning reserve amount determined under this approach? So I guess, in other words, you know, you've highlighted in your slides here that we would be using possibly the CEC's or probably the CEC's load forecast to determine the quarterly compliance obligation that the central procurement entity would be procuring to. But would there be a planning reserve that would be added to this? And if so, how much would it be and how would it be determined?
You know, the way that I would think about it that could be handled is in the determination of the annual firm energy magnitudes that are assigned to each resource that enable them to sell. But I guess, you know, my feeling would be is if I am a generator, you know, I would certainly not, you know, if I own 500 megawatt unit, I wouldn't sell 500 megawatt hours every single hour of every single day. That would probably be a pretty, you know, not past the sort of risk management portion of my firm. And so, you know, that's part of it. But one of the benefits of the mechanism is that it's recognizing that a planning reserve is less and less meaningful as we have more and more intermittent renewables on the system. So, and in addition, a planning reserve becomes less and less meaningful the more flexible demand that we have in the system, both of which we're trying to, this mechanism is essentially consistent with and encouraging. So, but again, it's not to say that you can't actually compute what you think would be a reasonable planning reserve, discuss what you might think would be a reasonable planning reserve, measure what you think might be a reasonable planning reserve, and publicize that to all market participants. I think that's extremely valuable thing to do and would strongly encourage it being done.
Okay, well, I know there's probably lots more questions, or, you know, I see a few that we haven't quite gotten to, and but we are at time, so we will have to take those offline, and feel free to email myself or Lenon your questions, and hopefully we can get them answered for you. Now we're going to be going over to Michelle's presentation. on bid cap to the RA framework. Lennon, would you be able to pull up the slide deck?
Yeah, Jamie, can you make me the presenter?
Sure. And while we're pulling up the slide deck, I just want to thank Professor Woloch for his participation in today's workshop. There's a lot to learn here with this proposal, and we really appreciate all your efforts in helping us better understand the proposal and how it works.
Hey, this is Michelle Quito. I'm going to be talking today just about another one of Energy Division's proposals that we put out to discuss. In the summer proposal, we had discussed Frank's proposal, another sort of energy related proposal, and then the least disruptive was just clarifying the MCC buckets and imposing a bid cap. And the idea of the bid cap was to address system market power concerns. Next slide. So this was just saying that in the initial proposal, we just put out there that we changed the existing buckets, and then we revised the RA product to include a least cost dispatch requirement or a bid cap. So previously, the utilities had 85% of the load. They're under CPUC jurisdiction, and they're required to bid in a least cost manner. And we showed in the proposal that we sent out on in the, I guess it was in December, that the utilities largely bid at or below the default bid, or at least load serving entities that have load generally bid at or below the default energy. Generators without load, some of them bid, higher than and considerably higher than the default energy bid. It turns out that, I'll talk a little bit about the August events, and it may not have made a difference because virtuals and DRs cleared the market. But if that's the case, then this bid cap proposal doesn't really affect market prices in any case. So it doesn't seem like it would in any fashion. So in December, on December 18th, we just put additional details so that people could react to it. And so we indicated that let's see. Oh, okay. Well, I guess this just says like initially, right now the bid cap is 1,000 rising to 2,000, and we proposed a bid cap. And it doesn't ensure that the entities do least cost bidding as required by the IOUs, but it does at least put a cap and subject them to some uncertainty if the bid cap is 300 and the price goes to 1,000 and they don't perform. Next slide, please. So the level of the price cap, we propose to set this at the higher of $300 per megawatt hour or the resource specific default energy bid. And that would be excluding non-resource specific default energy bids, such as those at the ties. So by setting at the higher of 300 or the default energy bid, it should capture potential gas price anomalies that arise. And then we looked at the bid curve during the price spikes, and it shows that the vast majority of bids were less than $300 a megawatt hour. And then I also just looked at the bid curves for 2019 and 2020. And for 2019, I'm not even sure the day I had ever cleared above 300. And in 2020, it did clear substantially above 300. But recall that this is just a limit on the bids for RA resources. It's not a limit on the clearing price. So in terms of verification enforcement, we proposed a two-pronged enforcement mechanism. One is that we could require it to be included in the RA contracts. And in addition, we could review the bidding behavior by market participants, and then we could refer load serving entities for non-RA compliance if the resources do not comply with the resource adequacy requirements per the contractual provisions. Next slide. So we proposed, or we put out there that that this proposed change could be implemented for the resource adequacy compliance year 2023, or it could be imposed in later years. The point being that, you know, if this is a big change to the market, this would allow market participants to revise contracts to the extent necessary. So we note that many people have said that there are legal obstacles to imposing a bid cap, and we'd note that the bid cap would only be for resource adequacy resources, and it would not preclude non-RA capacity from bidding at any level. So be they generation internal or even virtuals, for example. We'd note that the bid cap would be equally applicable to all resource types, so it's not discriminatory in that fashion. And then we noted that it doesn't necessarily disrupt existing contracts. So in addition, we would imagine that if there were any legal issues, they could be addressed between now and the implementation date. And I think we have a question.
Okay, so if you go to the last slide, Michelle, Mary Lynch is asking, what does refer mean? Refer to whom?
So that would be referring to our CPED. So what we would refer the LSE for non-compliance with the RA requirements, just as we intend to do with the imports. So to the extent that the imports don't meet the requirements, so they have a contractual requirement and they have a performance requirement, and we will be looking at the imports. And if they don't perform, we will be referring the LSEs to CPED for not meeting their RA requirements. So we suggest a similar performance or similar enforcement mechanism. Okay. Next slide. So we would note that there were concerns raised in comments, and so I'm going to state the concerns and then also just try to address them. So one is that a bid cap of $300 per megawatt hour could limit the ability of California LSCs and grid operators to attract capacity from neighboring balancing authorities. And I don't think that that's true, because my point is not that the market is capped at $300. My point is that the RA generator's bid is capped at 300 or the default energy bid. So what we're trying to get at here is making sure that all RA resources bid economically. And I think that's what we're aiming for in a competitive market, right? That the resources bid their true marginal costs. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that that happens. So this is just one way to address market power. It doesn't mean that non-RA resources can't bid higher than 300 or higher than their default energy bid. It doesn't mean virtuals can't bid that. And then I would note that in August, the DMM reran the market, and they said putting in the default energy bids for all the resources, as well as the default energy bids developed for the likes of PowerX, which are tied to indices, wouldn't have changed the outcome of the price, because the price were not set by these resources. They were set by the RDRR bids and the virtual bids. So I don't think that it sets the clearing price, it just sets the bidding price. Okay. Second, the bid cap that is lower than caps in neighboring balancing authorities may disrupt the state's ability to rely on imports from neighboring balancing authorities, particularly during stress conditions. And then again, I'd note that the bid cap is not a bid cap on the CAISO system, which we all know is $1,000 moving to $2,000. So it does not limit their ability to bid at whatever price they want to. It says that if you're in a resource adequacy bid, you have to have a cost-based bid. And again, I'd bring us back to market principles, and what we want all resources to be doing is bidding their marginal costs, which we think this allows them to do, because it doesn't say that they must bid 300, they must bid 300, the higher of 300 or their default energy bid. third point, a bid cap may not achieve energy division's goals of protecting customers from higher energy prices if non-resource resources continue to set energy prices above the cap. To make the proposal more resilient to future changes in market conditions, the offer cap should be indexed to fuel prices and/or other market fundamentals that may raise or lower the overall level of electricity prices. So it's true that it may not protect customers from high energy prices from non-RA resources, but what we're trying to do is at least have the RA resources who are paid capacity prices, reliability, to ensure that they do provide their energy to the market so that we don't get to the high energy price. So as you know, DMM found that many of the resources or some of the resources were not necessarily participating at their full amount and were bidding close to the cap. So we couldn't even reach that capacity. So if gas resources bid at 1,000, as some of them did, as shown by DMM's analysis from the July 30th and 31st timeframe, and prices are 800, but we still need the resources for reliability. If they're bidding at the cap, we can't get to them. I suppose we could exceptionally dispatch them. That's one way. And then I would say that it's already really indexed to fuel prices because default energy bids are indexed to fuel prices. So it does move up in the upward direction associated with market conditions. It doesn't move in the downward direction. We didn't say the lower of, we said the higher of. So it provides some protection, but it obviously doesn't provide all the protection that one might want. But we understand that we can't cover every eventuality. So the alternative way is to say that RA resources have a least cost dispatch requirement similar to the utilities. So for example, the utilities, when they bid in, their bids are reviewed every year to ensure that they are indeed bidding marginal cost. But since we don't control the bidding behavior of the generators, and we have more difficulty reaching into the CCAs to make sure that the resources that they have under contract are doing least cost dispatch, this seems like a sort of simpler way to go about this. Let's see. The fourth point people raised is coordination with CAISO necessary to ensure that there is no confusion regarding application of various caps. First of all, I think parties to the CAISO market are sophisticated and they understand the difference between the offer, or they're not offer caps, soft offer caps in CAISO's market and the RA caps that we put here. Ideally, CAISO would put it into their market, and I think we've even mentioned this, or maybe even the MSC members have mentioned this, and it seemed as if Jim Bushnell and maybe Scott Harvey were supportive of this idea of having a bid cap for RA resources. So from an economic perspective, I don't see the problem with it. But
Michelle, we have a few questions that are piling up.
Okay, great. Go ahead and take them. Sorry, I'm not keeping an eye on that.
It's okay. So first of all, can you clarify, is the bid cap for day ahead or also real time? Only or
it
also?
would be for both. So it would be day ahead and real time, but remember, it's a bid cap, the higher of the default energy bid or the $300. So to the extent that fuel prices changed real time and the default energy bid was vastly higher, it would rise as well. And recall that this is not a bid cap for the market itself. It's a bid cap for the generators bidding into the market.
Okay, great. And then would DR also be capped at 300 since they don't have a default energy bid?
Yes. So RDRR is at 950, but I think the purpose of getting PDR from my perspective is so that it meets our 1 and 2 load. And if you bid anything above 300, you're not meeting our 1 and 2 load.
Okay.
Because we don't get to $300 in any month except the summer. I mean, possibly if you're at $300, you're meeting maybe a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 10 load, but no, DR is capped. PDR would be capped at 300. I mean, this is part of the issue, right? Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
All right, and it looks like we have a comment or somebody wants to comment, so I'm going to unmute their mic. Ian White, I'm going to unmute your mic so you can say your question. Okay.
Yeah, hi there. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ian White with Shell Energy. I just want to kind of push back on the sort of the perspective that under a RA program, when a capacity is contracted for, that I think there's this sort of pseudo notion that under that kind of construct, when a capacity payment is made, that the energy is a freebie, is an add-on. And I mean, it's anecdotal, but it's like when you go to a restaurant, you make a reservation and the meal isn't just included. You have to pay a marginal cost for, you have to pay a cost for that meal. And the same with the
Let me
energy.
interrupt you though. Do you believe that default energy bids are marginal costs?
I think that it gets difficult when I believe it gets difficult when, like Professor Wolak was talking about, you have a system that requires a great amount of imports, and you don't have that. You don't know what external entities' costs are. You don't know
Okay, well,
what
let's
their
start with
stack.
internal resources. Do you object to internal resources?
I'm not. I don't really understand your question. I'm sorry.
Well, if you have all internal resources have to be resource specific, and so they all have default energy bids. So do you object to the notion of having a bid cap or a bid cap of 300 or the higher of the default energy bid, which is based on field costs, which should represent marginal cost?
I
Plus
think
a
that
20% adder?
I think that anytime you have certain classes of resources and you have administrative barriers for entry and barriers for bidding, it really doesn't create the best incentive for competition in the long run. And I think that the issue with that is anytime you affect sort of price formation, you affect and fundamentally interfere with forward resource procurement and hedging of anticipated load. And so that's where I think that we have to be careful to when we talk about price caps, and these are sort of fundamentally blunt instruments, which in my view a lot of times create seams issues. And so internal seams issues, especially like, I know you talked about demand response. You haven't yet talked about RDRR, but if you're a resource that is
Sorry,
participating
I did say that RDRR is at 950 or 1,000, and I did say that the RDRR and the virtuals cleared the market, and so this did not affect CAISO's rerun of the market with default energy bids. So I did address that.
Okay. The only point with RDRR that I was trying to make is, if you have participants in the RDRR program and you cap participation at a certain bid cap of 300, that may not cover those resources.
But I'm sorry, I don't think you heard me. I said RDRR remains at 950 or 1,000. I said PDR stays at 300.
Okay. Well, those are sort of just sort of my concerns. I think some of it will boil down to a philosophical approach. But I think that anytime we can really foster competition and trust the competitive process to help lower prices and ensure more sellers and incentivize new resources, that's probably the
Maybe you
right
could
approach in
answer a
my
question
view.
for me. In a competitive market, should generators be bidding their marginal cost or something else?
I think that a marginal cost approach makes sense. The problem is when you have a default energy bid that's calculated, that can be a blunt instrument at times because you bake everyone's cost in and peanut butter it over the system, and that may lead to overpayment for certain resources and underpayment for other resources. And I know we've
maybe you could answer another question. Let's say we pay a capacity price. Do you think it's reasonable to pay $2,000 to get the energy off the resource? And how does that provide reliability to the system?
So what I will say is that I can't speak to the specific instance, but because we live in an interconnected Western interconnection, and energy is substitutable between regions, that you have to put the system in, you have to put California in a place where it can compete with prices that may be in other regions. I understand that CAISO or California doesn't have insight into price formations in other regions. But because we're interconnected, resources will make decisions on, okay, you know, where to sell their energy. So I think that while a capacity component makes sense, you still, in my view, you still have to pay a marginal, some sort of marginal clearing value for energy.
But
and to the extent that you have large seams issues in California, to the extent you have large seams issues,
then a bid at the cap? Is that what I'm asking? What I'm getting?
no, that's not. I think maybe we're just talking past each other. So I'm just gonna I guess I'll follow up at another time. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Jamie, any other questions?
I think that all the questions have been answered. We had one that was asked and then you answered it regarding, I think, the RDRR. So yeah, we could keep going through the comments or the concerns raised in comments.
Okay, so let's see. Some folks are going to say the imposition of a bid cap could be interpreted as interfering with FERC wholesale market, and I would just note that it's applicable across the board, and that we could and would allow for legal challenge before we implemented it. So we get that folks would probably challenge it. We see that they say the proposed enforcement is unfair and unworkable. Yeah, ideally, you know, if we worked closely with CAISO and they implemented it, we wouldn't have to do it through the LSEs. But since they don't want to impose the RA bid cap of 300 or something, then we would have to do it through contracting and review and enforcement. I think this next one is the same, concerns regarding feasibility of the bid cap with regards to enforcement. And then there was a final question, should we consider a rebate mechanism alternative? And I'm not sure I totally understand that.
So I think that one, Michelle, is actually commented by PG&E. You know, as an alternative to a bid cap, something like what they're proposing in their contract hedging proposal, which would essentially be like a rebate mechanism that is a different way of incentivizing what you're trying to get out of a bid cap.
Oh, right. So yes, I get it. The contract structure where should there be additional markets rent, some portion of it would go back to the customer. So yeah, and that's an interesting idea as well. I think the idea is the bid cap is pretty easily implementable. And we raise this in because, you know, a lot of these proposals are complex. And if you're trying to deal with system market power, this is one way to do it by enforcing default energy bid. So yeah, so I think that's it. Those are the
And I want to make sure we answer Mary Lynch's question. I wasn't quite sure what you're asking here, the question or comment. So if this changes nothing in terms of outcomes, what function is this second level bid cap serving? I don't completely understand that. I don't know if you do, Michelle. I could.
Oh yeah. So okay. So let's see. So as I said, DMM reran the market from last summer, and that they determined if you'd run it with the default energy bids, both for external entities limited to the hydro opportunity cost at a distant hub, for external entities and internal entities, you did the default energy bids. It would not change the outcome of the market, and that's why, you know, we feel like that. Well, this is, I'm just digressing, but that's why we feel like the system market power proposal currently before CAISO would not, you know, change the market too much. However, to the extent that you have, you know, tight conditions, and you don't always, you can have system market power without having scarcity. And in recognition that the system can get tighter throughout the West, what you do prevent is exercise of system market power, which is raising prices higher than they would be otherwise or withdrawing from the market. So here, what you are trying to do is to keep internal generators, the generators under RA contract, from potentially contributing to the exercise of market power. So it will not reduce prices in all circumstances, but it's trying to prevent the more egregious things from happening in the future.
Okay, so that actually takes care of all the questions I've received thus far. We have about 3 minutes left before we're planning to break for lunch. Michelle, is there another slide we have to get through?
Next slide. I don't think so. Yeah, this just goes to what the back and forth between Shell and myself. So I'll just say that RA resources do have a must offer obligation to the CAISO that is meant to ensure that they are available to meet demand. Otherwise, what would be the purpose of having the must offer obligation? A MOOD does not dictate how a resource market. There is an expectation that the resource will bid economically because they have incentives to earn rents. But generators, importers, and third-party demand response plotters have been seemingly bidding above their marginal cost. So you'll recall a couple of years ago, we started dealing with the issue of speculative imports because we did see RA imports bidding, you know, higher than you would expect to clear, 500, 750, and 1,000. In addition, we have seen third-party PDR providers based on data from DMM bidding seemingly not to clear the market. And you can see it in the data for the generators, internal generators that don't have load bidding above their default energy bids. So this is meant to address all of those issues that we already do see in the market. Some have argued that RA is a call option at the bid cap, but I would note that this will not ensure reliability at least costs, nor can you really run an efficient market with many bidding uneconomically or at the cap. So if we have 40,000 megawatts bidding at the cap, we will clear at the cap. And it doesn't seem like I can tell California regulators, the governor, or the legislature that this is a system that is going to result in reliable, least cost energy procurement. So also we just note that there is no system level market power mitigation in place at CAISO to address these issues. The working assumption is the Western market is workably competitive, and therefore system level market power mitigation has not been undertaken. I think many things are challenging whether that is indeed the case. CAISO has proposed system market power mitigation in the real-time market, but recall the real-time market really only clears 5% of the transactions. The day-ahead market is 95% of the transactions. So finally, the RA construct is meant to ensure that the CAISO system has sufficient resources to meet demand, but an RA-only construct does not work if these RA resources flow to the highest bidder and out of state during reliability events. Yeah. And
okay.
Yeah, anyway.
One question came in, and I think this is from Ian. So I think what Ian wants to better understand is what a successful RA program would look like, and whether or not existing generators are making too much on RA at the expense of ratepayers. I think that a successful RA program could look something like, you know, all of the RA resources that are being paid a capacity revenue, you know, being subject to least cost dispatch requirements, similar to the way that it was envisioned with the IOUs when we moved to the RA framework that we have today, or the procurement RA framework that we have today. Michelle, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Nope, that sounds great. Thanks.
All right, it is 12:01. I did just see another question coming from Scott.
And does Eric Little have a question as well?
Does he have his hand up? Okay, so Scott asked, does the proposed CAISO changes in export priorities where only non-RA resources have priority over CAISO load help decrease the need for a cap? This is probably going to, okay, this is going to be probably a longer,
much longer discussion. And the problem is how you define non-RA. So you guys will probably hear me talk on CAISO's MSC meeting tomorrow. But I am fine if they actually have a contract. But there are lots of non-RA bids out there. And let me just give you one example. Last summer during the heat wave event, we have QF facilities whose qualifying capacity is based on their historical export. So they've got 100 megawatt PMAX, but we give them a 50 megawatt NQC because they have on-site load and they only serve 50 megawatts. Now imagine during the heat wave, we asked them to drop their on-site load and they started exporting up to their PMAX 100 megawatts. So that would be counted as a non-RA bid, right? Between the 50 and the 100 megawatts. Is that exportable? So there are a lot of questions about the issue of the export and load priorities that I still think need to be worked out. And I'll take this opportunity to say that I think that as a result, we should keep the PT exports equal to load until we've worked out these details. Not that I'm opposed to putting PT exports above load, but it seems like it's a prudent thing to do in the meantime until questions such as the one I just raised are addressed. So no, the export and load issue does not yet satisfy my concerns about the RA market. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see Eric's hand up. Do you?
No, I don't see it anymore.
Okay. All right, so it's 12:03. If we didn't get to your questions, which I see another one, but we're going to have to break for lunch and give everybody till 1 o'clock to take a break and come back. Appreciate your willingness to go over here, and we'll see you all back here at 1 o'clock, where we'll be where CAISO will be presenting on its UCAP proposal from 1 to 2. Thank you. All right, the recording has started. Welcome back to today's last segment of the Track 3B2 workshops. CAISO is going to be presenting on its UCAP proposal. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Bridget, and then Bridget, just let us know when you want to advance the slide.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you had a fulfilling and refreshing lunch after a long series of workshops. So thanks for giving the CAISO the opportunity to present further on our UCAP proposal. So if we move to the next slide, please. So for our time, we wanted to, rather than going back over specific details of the UCAP proposal, which we covered pretty extensively in the November workshop, we wanted to spend this time to just discuss with parties how our UCAP proposal might work in conjunction with some of the other high-level changes that we've been discussing throughout this workshop series, and discuss how we could incorporate UCAP into each of those proposals, and then think through how our current UCAP design might need to be altered slightly to better fit with each one of these proposals. And then finally, finish up by talking about, what are the benefits of UCAP and why we think it would be important to include in any of the sort of 3 options on the table for sort of redesign of the California RA program. So I think our plan is for me to go through, we only have about 7 slides, so it's sort of a short presentation, so kind of go through and lay out how we've been thinking about this. And then at the end, we'll have more of the Q&A portion. So as questions come up, feel free to include them in the Q&A, but we'll be reviewing those at the end. So let's move to the next slide, please. So as a refresher, the CAISO is proposing an unforced capacity valuation, which takes into account a resource's historic forced outage rate and includes some upfront in their capacity values. And so there's a couple different methodologies that ISOs and RTOs have used to do this evaluation. And so what the CAISO has developed in our stakeholder process is to use a seasonal availability factor based approach that would look at unit-specific availability factors during the tightest RA supply cushion hours. So basically, when RA was really tight on the system, showing that it was really critical to meet energy demand, during those hours is when we will be assessing a resource's forced outage rate, with the idea that in the future, we would expect them to have a similar level of reliability and availability. So the way that we're defining the RA supply cushion is we're going to look at the daily shown RA, excluding wind and solar, and then netting out all the outages, covering net loads, and covering our contingency reserves. So basically, how much RA is left over once we've met our net loads, reserves, and covered the outages. And so these resource availability factors will incorporate historic force and urgent D rates and outages to determine the resource's expected future availability and contributions to reliability. And so we're proposing to incorporate UCAP into the NQC value of resources. So under this paradigm, NQC would represent both the deliverability and the availability of the resource. And so we're not proposing any changes to the way that we study deliverability, but rather adding in the availability of the resource into the NQC values as well. And so again, the CAISO presented its UCAP proposal in detail during the November 23rd workshop. And so we want to take this time to discuss how our proposal fits with other proposals submitted in this proceeding. But if folks have questions about our proposal or the way that individual resources will be calculated, or any other clarifying questions you might have, we're also happy to discuss more of the details of UCAP. But again, the focus of our time today is more so discussing how UCAP can fit in with some of these other proposals we've been discussing. Next slide. So on Monday, we discussed the PG&E slice of day proposal. And so we think that UCAP can be modified to fit in with this proposal. While the CAISO does feel that the slice of day adds some significant concerns with how we do local RA and being able to validate this and some of the impacts it might have on our systems, we do think that UCAP could be incorporated into PG&E's proposal. And so with a few modifications. So we still think that we could assess resources' historic forced outage rates during the tightest RA supply cushion hours, but do this during each slice of day that the resource wanted an NQC value for. And so the MOO would still be at the deliverable capacity for each slice of day, so that the portfolio would still be able to provide that substitute capacity. And so rather than what we currently have as a seasonal approach, where we have looking at forced outage rates across a 6-month period, we would be breaking that out further to whatever the slice of days that the Commission ultimately decided on with this proposal. So in their original written proposal, they had 3 slices, but in the presentation, they had more like 4 to 6. So however the slices end up being, we could, during each of those slices, look at the tightest RA supply cushions, hours within those time slices, and then calculate a forced outage rate during those periods. One thing that is different in terms of resource counting is that PG&E originally proposed to use an exceedance methodology for resource counting, but we think that instead of using exceedance methodology, it would be better off to use the UCAP for each resources or the ELCC value because this better captures coincident outages. So exceedance methodology might tell you when an individual resource was available, but it doesn't really give you any information around what the rest of the resource portfolio was doing. And so was its availability tied to critical grid needs, or was it just when it was available? So we think that UCAP can give a little bit more information about the resources availability in relation to times when the grid is most stressed. So again, it can provide you more coincidental information about the resources availability that we might be able to gain from the exceedance methodology. And so here I provide sort of a stylized example of how this might work. So for instance, say we have a 24/7 gas generator who wants to be able to sell RA for each of the slice of day. And so here we have a 500 megawatt PMAX resource that's 100% deliverable, but has a regulatory restriction that prevents it from operating between 12 and 6 a.m. So it has a noise ordinance, so it can't run overnight. So here we have sort of 3 slices. And so because of that overnight restriction, it is not available in that first time slice, hour ending 23 to 7. So its average forced outage rate is 75%. And so its availability factor is 0.286 times the 500 gives it a final NQC value of 143. So it would be valued at 143 megawatts for this time slice. But its MU would still be at its deliverable capacity, recognizing that it does have operational restrictions. Whereas in the second time slice, it only has a 5% outage rate, and so it can sell up to 475 megawatts during this time slice. And then in the sort of net load peak area, it has a slightly higher outage rate of 10%, and so it would only be eligible to sell 450 megawatts. But again, in each of these periods, it would still have a must offer at its deliverable capacity. And so this is to ensure that within each time slice, there is substitute capacity to cover the expected outage rate of the fleet. So for this proposal, again, we think it can work, and we can tweak the sampling methodology of the forced outage rates to align with the slice of day. And by looking at the tightest RA supply cushion hours within each of those time slices, again, you'll get a better picture of the resources availability under those more stressed periods. So let's move on to the next slide. Then looking at SCE CalCCA's joint proposal, the CAISO believes that our current seasonal average availability factor proposal could be incorporated into this proposal without significant redesign. And so yesterday, I believe Stephanie also mentioned that there is a lot of sort of ease and co-alignment between UCAP and the joint proposal, and that UCAP, since it's incorporated into NQC, has a natural influence on the net qualifying energy of the resource. And this can help us better reflect the unit's energy availability by taking into account its average forced outage rates. And so UCAP, under this framework, provides a stronger check on net qualifying energy than RAIN would today, and again, provide better information about what is the expected both reliability and energy contribution of this unit. So one possible area that we want to maybe think through a little bit more is there's still this open question around severability of net qualifying energy from net qualifying capacity and being able to sell those two products differently. And so the CAISO just has some questions around how this might affect the must offer obligation and whether this increases the difficulty of setting the appropriate MOO to provide the intended substitute capacity for expected forced add rates of the portfolio. And we want to think through how this might impact the MOO if we were to separate these out. But again, we think that the joint proposal and UCAP fit relatively well together, and I think UCAP would, again, provide the complement benefit to the net qualifying energy by better reflecting the unit's availability and thus a better idea of what energy we can actually expect from the unit. Next slide. And then today we heard more about the standard forward energy contract that Energy Division staff has put forward in conjunction with Professor Wolak. And so we believe that UCAP could be incorporated into proposals by using the UCAP value of the resource to set a limit on how much energy a resource could sell in the forward auction. And so, for instance, if we had a 100 megawatt gas unit that had a 10% forced outage rate, they would be eligible to sell up to 788,400 megawatt hours in the annual firm energy. So basically 90 megawatts times 8,760. And so Professor Wolk mentioned doing this on a quarterly basis. And so depending on how the auction is going to be run in terms of time periods that people are buying for, we may want to tweak UCAP to better adjust the seasons. So rather than doing 2 seasons as we have today, if it was a quarterly auction, we could augment UCAP to look at the tightest hours in each of those quarters to derive the outage rates. Or we may also want to look beyond just forced outage rates and look at planned outages, depending on how we would imagine substitute capacity being procured, or leave it up to the generator to decide the risk they want to take in covering their planned outages when they're supposed to be bidding in the energy for their contracted standardized contracted value that they sold in the auction. However, the CAISO will note that we think that the CAISO tariff would have to have a radical overhaul to align with this new construct. And we're very concerned about conflicts with other LRAs who may maintain a capacity construct. And so there's definitely a lot of open questions around with this sort of new radical redesign of moving away from a capacity construct to a forward energy auction construct, what that would mean for most of the RE provisions of the CAISO tariff. And again, we're concerned about how to run sort of 2 different RA constructs between CPUC entities and then other LRAs who may not adopt a similar construct. And so while we think UCAP could work with this proposal, we have additional concerns outside of UCAP around how this might impact the CAISO tariff. Next slide. And then finally, we think that UCAP has a lot of benefits. And so the unforced capacity evaluations, we think promote procurement of the most dependable and reliable resources upfront by accounting for historic unavailability in their capacity values. So this allows LLCs to take historic availability into consideration when making procurement decisions. So again, it provides more information around what is the reliability of the unit that they're contracting with. It allows the CAISO to eliminate complicated and ineffective forced outage substitution rules and promotes investment in maintenance to keep capacity values high on the part of the generators. It helps remove incentives to withhold excess capacity from the market to cover substitutions. So because folks no longer need to keep capacity back to cover substitutions. Because the portfolio already does this, then it will hopefully encourage LSCs to sell off excess capacity that they no longer need to hold on to for substitutions. And then it also improves capacity pricing transparency by removing replacement costs from contracts. And then additionally, UCAP will dynamically change with the fleet's forced outage rate. So currently, forced outage rates are included in the planning reserve margin, which is a static value. So by taking the forced outage rate out of the PRM and incorporating it into resources capacity values, it will naturally change with the way that the forced outage rates change. So if we see increases in the future, rather than having to renegotiate what the PRM is, UCAP naturally will pick up on these changes in forced outage rates. And so it will sort of help reduce the instances of over or under procurement to capture these changes in forced outage rates. So in the future, under UCAP paradigm, the planning reserve margin would only need to cover 6% of operating reserves plus forecast error based on load levels. So again, we think that UCAP helps future-proof the RA program by, again, taking out the variable forced outage rates from the PRM and putting in the resources capacity values. And that way, as they change over time, UCAP will naturally pick up these changes. So that is what we had prepared. And so, Lauren, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, so we have a couple questions in Q&A and a couple of hands raised. Let's start with the questions in the Q&A. I can read those. We'll start with a question from Dariush. Please confirm that UCAP would only apply to non-energy limited controllable resources, for example, gas-fired, geothermal, etc. What about energy limited controllable resources like battery storage or hydro?
So UCAP would apply to all dispatchable resources. And so this would be thermal, storage, hydro, DR, hybrids, imports. So we, in our proposal, we provide more details around how we would be calculating UCAP values for each of these different resource types. And so because resources have different ways to reflect their availability, we provide sort of tweaks to the basic framework to better capture their forced outage rates. And so for non-dispatchable resources, the CPUC's QC methodology already, because it looks at historic performance, it already captures those forced outage rates. So for non-dispatchable resources whose QCs already look at forced outage rates, we wouldn't be proposing any changes. But for all of the resources that the QC doesn't capture the forced outage rates, they would be getting a unique UCAP value. And then for wind and solar resources, we would be using ELCC values.
Okay, let's go to the next question in the chat, and then we can go to the questions that we have on the phone. Scott Olson asks, does CAISO believe the major changes in track 3B2 are needed for reliability, or would a simpler approach of UCAP with MCC and ELCC changes plus peak load planning be okay?
So that's a big question, and
yeah,
I think that Carl, if you want to...
Yeah, I was going to say, can we open up the phone line there for Scott? I'd kind of like to dig a little bit deeper into the question to make sure we answer what's been asked, because there's a lot moving in that one. So.
Okay, Scott, I'm gonna unmute your mic.
Oh, Carl, I was hoping you would just say yes or no. So
Nah, it's not that
obviously,
easy.
yeah, I know, right? Yeah. Obviously here in track 3B2, these are major changes that are being proposed. And I don't think there's been an answer yet to say, do these actually enhance reliability for the amount of work that would be required to go into them? At the outset on Monday, the discussion was anyone can probably get there. It's just a matter of the money and the time and complexity that it takes. So an alternative is not to do any of these and to just kind of stay status quo, but make some changes per my question for things like the MCC buckets, how you calculate ELCC, net peak load changes, similar to what's being proposed in track 3B1. Just curious what CAISO's view on, does a massive overhaul, is it needed? Is it necessary? Is that what you think is required to really get the reliability we need? Or could this be done in a simpler approach tied to UCAP?
So unfortunately, I think we are looking at a time where some significant overhaul is needed. I mean, we've been working on our enhancements now for some time, looking at some of the elements that we at the ISO would try and implement some of those in conjunction with the PUC. In the, I don't know exactly what they're calling it now, but the summer reliability proceeding that's going on as well as the CPUC. Excuse me one second. Pardon me. The ISO has noted that, we're looking for help in the form of an increased planning reserve margin, at least for an interim, until we can have something like a UCAP and a portfolio assessment to look at the overall needs of the fleet during both peak and net peak intervals. So I think as we've seen the needs shift to, that peak interval of the day to both peak and net peak, I think we're going to need some bigger overhauls. Obviously, some of the proposals we put forward here have basis and precedent in other ISOs and RTOs. So we've seen how they work and how well they can work. Other elements, that we're working on, like the portfolio analysis, are pretty new. Some of our proposals, as I think Bridget's gone through quite well, work better with some of the large overhauls that we've heard. For example, we think that the alignment with the Edison Cal CCA proposal can be attained reasonably easy. Trying to pair it with the PG&E slice of day or the energy division's energy contracting, it's a much more challenging connection to do that. So we think the shift to UCAP is just generally helpful in saying, let's get the most reliable resources we can, keep those online. If we're going to start pushing resources out of the system, let's not just push any old resource out. Let's make sure that we're retiring the least reliable resources as we go. So that's a long answer to saying, I think that some of these changes are needed. How quickly we can get them done, it's a great question. But I do think we need a significant overhaul.
Okay, so it looks like those were the questions that we have in the chat. It looks like we have a couple on the phone as well. Jamie, maybe if you could unmute Peter's line.
Hi, this is Peter Griffiths, PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, and Bridget, thank you for this presentation. It's good to see that you're thinking and paying attention to what's going on in the discussion at the commission in terms of overhaul of the RA structure. I guess my concern to some degree is that it seems that certainly when you look at the PG&E slice of day, it's changing the nature of sort of the NQC is for everything. And that's one feature, I think, of the UCAP approach that the ISO has proposed, that is that it is not changing the counting or the availability or looking at the availability of wind and solar. And so I guess my question is the ISO still confident that the wind and solar can produce at the levels of the ELCC in all hours of the month for which it's being shown?
Peter, this is Carl. I think the answer for that is absolutely no. We know that's not the case. That's the nature of the modeling, right? Is that, the LCC value is a probabilistic assessment set to a standard, and we know that in some hours, as we witnessed in August, your actual output falls below the expected. Happens that way every day, and that happened to be a couple days where we happened to be tight elsewhere, and we saw what ensued. So no, we don't think that that's the case, but we think also that the standard to which we're planning procuring to needs to be adjusted as well to something that's not as static, that is a little bit more dynamic, and can account for an overall operational standard comparable to 1 in 10 or something of the like, a probability that RA is able to meet our needs, like we've talked about in the portfolio assessment. So we don't think that wind and solar will perform up to ELCC values at all times. That's how that number is derived. But again, if we have an appropriate planning standard in terms of loss of load or unserved energy or whatever standard we elect to move to, I think that's what we need to achieve is that probabilistic. I guess it's kind of an oxymoron to say this, but probabilistic certainty.
Yeah, and I guess the concern I have is that you're basically saying that you want to rely on other types of resources when some resources aren't able to produce, and when they're not able to produce. And I guess in my mind, doesn't that lead to essentially relying on more resources than you may need in some periods, and relying on having too many resources in some periods? For instance, I mean, you're basically saying that wind and solar can count at their full ELCC value, and that's what they should count at in all hours. However, you're also saying that at a net load peak time period, you don't want to count them for anything, and that you need to have more resources for that to meet load in those periods.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter, this is John. I think the tension that we're all facing and experiencing here is that there's absolute merit to what PG&E is proposing, a slice a day, because that's sort of the most precise way to get at the problem. I think we all are seeing the problem, but how to achieve a solution to it is complicated. And I think the tension we're experiencing is that where's that right balance between how precise and complex do we make the RA program versus more workable, flexible, tradable, blah, 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 etc. And neither is perfect. Totally get the ELCC overcounts in certain hours, but a slice a day, frankly, is really complicated too. And so even though it may be more precise. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. It's just sort of this tension that we're all wrestling with, how to solve this very challenging problem with, growing reliance on energy use and availability limited resources. So I appreciate your question. I'm just not sure if there's a great answer.
Yeah, and I guess, John, I appreciate it. It is a hard problem, and it's a hard problem we're trying to solve. I guess the one concern that I have to some degree is that it's not at all clear that the net load peak is necessarily going to be the time of day or the period of when there will be stress on the system. And
yeah, I agree.
It's not clear sort of whether relying on sort of the full output of resources, for in their production in a planning sort of way, is the right way to be able to anticipate some of those future problems. But okay, I mean, I appreciate it. I mean, I think you probably may want to think about the UCAP for the slice of day a little different, because we're not essentially certainly for the wind and solar, we're not saying that it would be able to count at its ELCC value, and that's the appropriate measure for each of those. So there should be some sort of thought about how that might be taken.
I think that's a great point. Because like you say, you don't treat wind and solar that way. It gets treated for what it can deliver in that slice. And so I think that's a very good and valid point.
Yeah. So you may want to think about it, and I understand that you're really just looking at these and giving it a first pass in terms of how this might work with the various proposals. So that's all I have.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So we have another question in the chat from Kyle Navis, and it says, so in the PG&E slice of day proposal, UCAP would retain the single ELCC value for wind and solar resource in every slice of day rather than generating a separate ELCC value for each slice. I think that kind of goes to what we were just talking about with Peter in the last question. That's something that we would have to think about further as we evaluate the PG&E proposal. Okay, Jamie, did you have a question?
I think my question was kind of answered with the discussion with Peter, but just if you could flip back to the calculation of the supply cushion real fast. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So one more slide. Okay. So the supply cushion calculation actually subtracts out the wind and solar, the variable resources. And I'm wondering, because you also have this category of non-dispatchable resources that wouldn't be subject to UCAP because of the way that their resources are accounted for, utilizing historical performance data already kind of embeds that forced outage rate into it. Would you also need to factor that into the supply cushion, similar to how you are taking out the wind and solar?
That's not something we had contemplated, but I can definitely take it back and think about it a little bit more. I think our original thought behind excluding wind and solar and looking at net loads rather than gross loads is because we know that the capacity values of wind and solar is much lower than what they tend to produce in real time. So we know that at any given hour, the ELCC is probably counting in some and over counting in others. And so by excluding wind and solar and looking at net loads, we kind of take away that impact. But in terms of non-dispatchable resources, it may not be as necessary if the capacity values are more representative of their sort of expected output at any given hour, and how much that is as sort of variable as wind and solar. So Carl, I don't know if you have things to add.
Yeah, Jamie, I just want to make sure. So is the question similar to saying, why didn't you take run-of-river hydro out?
I guess it could be that, or just, we're accounting for wind and solar in this way in our definition of what the supply cushion is. And I thought that was kind of tied to how we're accounting for it in the way that we're allowing it to not be subject to the UCAP calculation. And so I guess my question was kind of like, well, why aren't we doing the same thing for non-dispatchable resources?
No, it's,
but I could be thinking about it wrong.
No, I think we before we try and give you an answer on that, Jamie, I think it's a reasonable question. I think for, and I think it goes back to Dariush's question about, what are we talking about applying the UCAP to? On some of those historic resources, they've already got that outage taken into account. So we're not looking to change those, but I don't think that means we take them out. I'd have to think about how that might change things in terms of how we calculate supply cushions and the like.
Okay, so I think we've answered all the questions that are in the chat. I do see a hand up from Peter still. I don't know if that was left over from the last discussion or if you have a new question or comment. Okay, it just went down, so I think that's the case. So I'm not seeing any other questions left, Jamie. So I guess with that, we can turn it back over to you at this point.
Oh, sorry, this is Michelle. I do have a couple of questions. Let me just look. So when you're doing the UCAP, are you basing that on bids, not just forced outages?
No, it's based on OMS outages.
So what if they what if they don't have outages but they don't bid?
We're also proposing to reform the bid insertion proposal to ensure that resources are bidding in.
And so would those bids go in for all resources? So gas, storage, hydro, renewables, DR, imports?
We have,
yeah,
I can take this one. So yeah, we are trying to limit the number of exemptions that we have to the bid insertion proposal, but most resources would have bid insertion. We wouldn't do bid insertion for like DR, for example, because they don't have default energy bids. We have a small list that we would continue to exempt from bid insertion, but most resources would continue to have bid insertion.
And would they have bid insertion for the real time as well as the day ahead?
Right now, we're just proposing rules for day ahead. Of course, we'll have to see, we're still working through the real-time must-offer obligation and the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. So at this point, we're just proposing changes for the day-ahead market.
But what if somebody just bids $1,000 and so you don't need a bid insert, but then they're not available to real time? How does that address reliability?
Yeah,
Michelle,
so I think they still have.
I mean, this
Carl.
question about, economic withholding, right, Michelle? I mean, they bid in. If they've been dispatched and don't perform, they're going to be subject to the, imbalance energy and flexi ramp costs. From a capacity standpoint.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they bid in at 1,000, the market clears at 950, then they don't get picked up for the real time, and then they're no longer, there's no further requirements for the real time. How does that ensure reliability?
So again, as Lauren noted, the real-time must-offer obligation is being worked out in conjunction with the day-ahead market enhancements, where what they'll also include in what gets picked up in the day-ahead is the imbalance reserve product to account for that uncertainty and deviations between day-ahead and real-time needs. So, they expect that they're going to need some probability of, they've under procured in day-ahead relative to what they thought they need, or relative to what the forecast errors bandwidth dictates. They'd have that additional capacity procured with the must-offer obligation into real time.
But what if you got it wrong and then we have an emergency in the real time and we've released them with no further real time bids?
I think the idea of the imbalanced reserve is to have that capacity to basically probabilistically minimize that outcome, which is to say,
one way to probabilistically ensure that you minimize that outcome would be to over procure that capacity resource, right?
Michelle, how's it different than a long start generator, or a lot of the DR is long start? If you don't take it day ahead, game over. I mean, part of this is sort of fundamental to the nature of resources or how resources set themselves up.
Yeah, I mean, I personally believe that, you know, CAISO should look at how people categorize themselves as long start units and put in those costs. I think that's part of the issue that I'm kind of trying to address. For a gas unit, I get it that they're a long start unit, but you guys have exceptional dispatch and you have the RUC process to get them in there. Even if, I mean, I guess what you're saying is you'll pick them up through the reliability capacity product, but that's an expensive proposition to make sure that you cover all the reliability, and it's an additional payment, right? And so since it's RA and we've paid for it and it could be available in the real time, but we're going to pay it. I guess it's, yeah, okay. Okay.
Michelle, and I think that the philosophical argument that you've had once already today is, did you pay for the energy or did you pay for the capacity under RA? And we're not going to solve that here, but everybody can have their opinion about that. I understand you have an opinion, but others have different opinions about whether you procured the energy with that RA capacity. And a lot of people feel RA capacity is just that. It's just capacity. It's separate from the energy. So we can argue all day about this and everybody else can, but we're not going to solve it here.
Okay. Just from a reliability perspective, though, I think it's a really important conversation to have, because if we're buying the capacity for reliability and it doesn't provide reliability, it calls into question why we buy it. I think that's why we continue to have this discussion. And you're right, we won't agree. So I will, I'll reserve it for another time.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I disagree with you, Michelle. I have that very concern on most of the DR, frankly, and what we're paying for. So.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess, you know, DR, I would also say, you know, DMM's analysis did show that the gas units on July 30th and 31st, that, you know, a fair number of them were bidding well above their default energy bid. In addition, you can see that RA imports in CAISO's analysis were bidding at 500 or 1,000 as well. So, so yeah, these issues aren't just concerned, you know, in my perspective, are not just confined to DR, but they do raise a host of issues. So thank you.
Yeah, I just say finally, Michelle, that again, on the imports, we do compete in a West-wide market. If we're going to rely on our neighbors' energy, then we have to be realistic that we're competing against $1,600 prices at PV, for example. So we have to be sort of intellectually honest about some of this.
Yeah, you know what? That's why exactly that I like pseudo-tied resources. So for example, Southern California Edison has Palo Verde under contract, and so we expect it to deliver the energy. And we have Hoover under contract and we expect it to deliver energy. So we've paid the capacity and we are paying the energy price, but to pay the capacity and then get $1,500 prices just doesn't seem like a recipe that I can sell to legislators, the governors, and my regulators. So thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A or on the phone lines. So Jamie, I think at this point we can turn it over to you unless you're seeing anything else that I'm missing.
I don't see anything either. So maybe we could have you guys review. Well, first of all, thank you so much for presenting on this topic in relation to kind of the context and proposals that are in our Track 3B2 and thinking about how the UCAP proposal would fit into these kind of structural changes to the program. So appreciate the details that you and thought that you put into this. Would it be worth, just because we do have a few more minutes, would it be worth talking about your guys' process with regards to the proposal and you know, outside the CPUC proceeding and where where you're at and plan to go regarding this proposal?
Sure, yeah, so I can talk to that a little bit. So as I'm sure many of you on this call know, we are also stakeholdering this UCAP proposal and the rest of our RA enhancements proposals in the RA enhancements initiative at the CAISO. We recently published and held calls on our 6th revised straw proposal on UCAP, as well as the draft final proposal on other elements. At this time, we are continuing to refine the UCAP proposal and add additional detail in the RA enhancements initiative. We are planning to submit that proposal in this proceeding, as well as publish a draft final proposal and take it to our board later this year. That process will happen probably after the June decision for these Track 3B proposals. And so that's a little bit about the process for UCAP that's taking place on the CAISO side. So hopefully that's helpful, and make sure you tune in there as well. In addition to this RA proceeding, because we'll continue to refine that proposal there. Jamie, is that kind of what you're looking for, or do you have any other?
Yeah, I think that's really important that we, I think that was perfect. I think it's really important we just make sure that parties understand kind of the two different processes that are happening and how they potentially fit together, and then maybe just the importance of thinking about this proposal in the context of these other proposals is really critical, because, you know, we're one here is addressing, or CAISO's proposal is attempting to address the forced outage component, you know, of the problem. And these other proposals are trying to address kind of the use limited resources and reliance on them, and the growing reliance on them in the future. So thinking about the two together is important. Lenon, would you mind scrolling back to our slides that show the calendar for the next steps? I know they're not our next steps, but just I want to bring up the calendar before we conclude for the day. So here's our calendar, our schedule for Track 3B2. The next date here you'll see is February 26th. So that'll be another opportunity for proposals to be submitted in this track of the proceeding, and refinements to be made. And then we'll have a chance for parties to comment on March 12th and March 23rd, provide reply comments with a proposed decision expected in May of 2021. So thank you so much for all your time this week. I really appreciated all the dialogue. As a reminder, all of the workshops have been recorded, and we will post all of the materials as well as those recordings on our RA history website. If you have questions, please feel free to contact myself or Lenon. We'd be happy to try and attempt to answer your questions and get back to you, well, answer those questions. Thanks again.